Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. Tonight we're going to tell the story of a family. And I know, that sounds modest for a channel that once spent 4 hours on the fall of Rome. But this particular family ruled 1/6 of the Earth's surface, built an empire from a frozen wilderness into a world power, produced some of history's most extraordinary and most catastrophic human beings, and ended in a basement in the Ural Mountains in the summer of 1918. The Romanovs. 300 years, one dynasty, and a finale that still haunts the world. Before the Romanovs, the world they inherited to understand the Romanovs, you first have to understand the world they walked into, and that world was, to put it gently, a mess. Russia in the centuries before the Romanov dynasty was not the vast brooding superpower that later writers would romanticize. It was a young, fractured, deeply uncertain place, shaped by rivers and forests and a geography so enormous that organizing it into anything resembling a coherent state seemed, on most days, like an act of profound optimism. Let us start from the beginning, or close enough to it. The Russian state traces its earliest roots to the 900s, when a federation of Slavic peoples along the great rivers of Eastern Europe began to coalesce under the leadership of princes based in Kiev. This was Kievan Rus, and for a time it was a genuine power. It traded with Byzantium, adopted Orthodox Christianity in 988 under Prince Vladimir, built magnificent churches, and developed a rich culture that blended Slavic traditions with Byzantine sophistication. Kiev was, in these centuries, one of the great cities of the medieval world, larger than Paris, wealthier than most of its European contemporaries, a place of learning and commerce and genuine ambition. And then the Mongols arrived. In 1237 and 1238, the armies of Batu Khan swept across the steppe and into the heart of Kievan Rus. What followed was catastrophic. Cities were razed, populations were decimated. Kiev itself, that jewel of early Russian civilization, was reduced to rubble. The chronicles written by monks in the aftermath describe a landscape of silence, where once there had been markets and churches and the sounds of daily life, there was now only ash and emptiness. The Mongol conquest did not simply damage Kievan Rus, it effectively ended it. The political vacuum left behind was filled slowly, painfully over the next 2 centuries. Various princes competed for dominance in what remained of the Russian lands. The Principality of Moscow, Muscovy, gradually emerged as the most powerful of these competing states. Its rulers were shrewd, patient, sometimes ruthless men, who understood that survival in this fractured world required both diplomacy and a willingness to fight. They paid tribute to the Mongol Golden Horde when necessary and took territory when they could. The figure who transformed Moscow from a minor principality into the nucleus of a genuine Russian state was Ivan III, known to later generations as Ivan the Great. Ruling from 1462 to 1505, Ivan was a strategist of the First Order. He married Sophia Palaeologina, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, which gave Moscow a claim to be the inheritor of Byzantine civilization and Orthodox Christian authority. He famously declared Moscow the Third Rome, after Rome itself and Constantinople had fallen, the spiritual centre of the Christian world. This was not mere vanity, it was ideology, and it served Ivan well. It gave his state a sense of divine mission, a cosmic purpose that justified both its authority over other Russian princes and its resistance to foreign powers. Ivan the Great also ended the formal submission of Moscow to the Golden Horde. The Mongol successor states were fragmenting, and Ivan was shrewd enough to recognize the moment. In 1480, at the famous stand on the Ugra River, Ivan's forces and those of the Horde faced each other across the water for weeks, neither side willing to commit to battle until the Horde finally withdrew. No great clash occurred, but the message was clear. Moscow was no longer a tributary state, it was sovereign. His grandson, Ivan IV, was the figure who truly defined the character of the Russian state that the Romanovs would inherit. Ivan IV became Grand Prince of Moscow at the age of 3, after his father died in 1533. His childhood was brutal. The great boyar families, the old aristocracy who had served previous princes, treated the young ruler essentially as a puppet while they competed among themselves for power. Ivan watched. He listened. He waited. And what he absorbed in those years was a profound, lifelong conviction that power, real power, could never be shared. It could only be held or lost. When Ivan assumed personal rule at the age of 16, he made a dramatic declaration. He took the title Tsar from the Latin Caesar a deliberate statement that he was not merely a prince but an emperor, the legitimate successor of both the Roman and Byzantine traditions. He was the first Russian ruler to formally use this title, and the ceremony of his coronation in 1547 was designed to make that claim as visible as possible. With all the pomp and religious authority the Orthodox Church could provide, Ivan's early reign was actually quite promising. He reformed the legal system, reorganized the military, and expanded Russian territory dramatically, defeating the Mongol successor states of Kazan and Astrakhan, and opening the way to Siberia. His court sponsored art and literature. For a time, he seemed like a capable and even visionary ruler, and then something changed. In 1560, Ivan's wife Anastasia died. Whether she was poisoned, as Ivan apparently believed, or simply died of illness remains debated by historians. What is beyond debate is that her death unhinged him. The man who emerged from grief was different from the man who had entered it. Suspicious, volatile, given to sudden rages that could tip into extreme violence. He began to see enemies everywhere, and in a court where genuine conspiracies were not uncommon, his paranoia had just enough grounding in reality to feed itself endlessly. In 1565, Ivan created the Oprichnina, a state within the state, a territory under his personal control staffed by a new order of black-robed horsemen who answered only to him. These men, the Oprichniki, were unleashed on the boyars and anyone else Ivan suspected of disloyalty. The terror they inflicted was real and widespread. The city of Novgorod, suspected of harbouring treasonous correspondence with Poland, was subjected to a weeks-long massacre in 1570. Thousands died. The Volkhov River, according to one chronicle, ran red, and then in 1581, in a moment of blind fury, Ivan struck his own son and heir with a staff during an argument, fatally wounding him. He held the dying young man in his arms, weeping, finally horrified by what he had done. The famous painting by Ilya Repin depicting this scene captures something essential about Ivan, not just a tyrant, but a man whose capacity for violence destroyed the very things he loved most. When Ivan died in 1584, he left behind a state that was powerful in territory, traumatized in spirit, and dangerously unstable at the top. His remaining heir was Fyodor, a gentle and deeply pious man who had no interest in ruling and no particular ability for it. Real power passed to Fyodor's brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, a capable administrator who governed effectively, but lacked the dynastic legitimacy that Russian political culture considered essential. When Fyodor died in 1598 without an heir, the Rurik dynasty that had ruled Russia since the 9th century came to an end. Boris Godunov was elected Tsar by the Zemsky Sobor, the assembly of the land, a body of nobles, clergy, and representatives of the towns. It was a reasonable solution to an unprecedented problem, but it was also a solution that never quite convinced anyone, including, one suspects, Boris himself. The land he governed was extraordinary in scale and fragile in cohesion. Russia by the late 1500s stretched from the Baltic approaches in the west to the Urals in the east, from the Arctic in the north to the edges of the steppe in the south. It was bigger than any country in Europe. It was also sparsely populated, poorly connected by roads, deeply divided between a tiny aristocratic elite and a vast peasant majority who were in the process of being bound more and more tightly to the land through serfdom. The Orthodox Church gave the state a spiritual identity, binding ordinary Russians to a sense of community and shared faith that transcended regional differences. The Tsar was not merely a political leader, but a sacred figure, the little father, Batushka, whose authority came from God. This fusion of political and religious legitimacy was one of Russia's most distinctive features, and would remain central to its political culture through all the centuries of Romanov rule. But in 1598, with the Rurik line extinct and a newly elected Tsar on the throne, none of that tradition could quite paper over the fundamental fragility of the situation. Russia had a ruler. What it was about to discover was how much it had relied on the idea of a dynasty, the unbroken bloodline, the son succeeding the father, the continuity of legitimate rule. Without it, everything was suddenly in question. The time of troubles, Russia on the edge of extinction. There is a phrase in Russian history that translates as the time of troubles, smutnoye vremya, and it describes the period from roughly 1600 to 1613. Saying it was a bad time is a bit like saying the Titanic had a difficult crossing, technically accurate, rather missing the point. What happened to Russia in these years was something close to total collapse. State authority dissolved, famine killed hundreds of thousands, foreign armies occupied Moscow itself, a succession of pretenders claimed the throne, each one more implausible than the last. And through it all, the question that haunted every noble, every churchman, every frightened peasant was the same. Would Russia survive? It began with Boris Godunov, who had been a genuinely capable ruler, but who suffered from a problem that no amount of administrative competence could solve. He was not a Rurikid. He had not inherited the throne by blood. He had been chosen, which in the political imagination of 17th century Russia was fundamentally different. When things went well, this could be overlooked. When things went badly, it became the explanation for everything. Things went very badly indeed. In 1600, Russia was struck by a catastrophic famine that lasted 3 years. The harvest failed repeatedly, and the scale of the suffering was almost incomprehensible. Contemporary accounts describe roads lined with corpses, parents abandoning children, people eating bark and grass, and in the worst cases, resorting to things too terrible to write about. Boris Godunov responded with genuine effort, distributing grain from state stores and trying to organize relief, but the famine was simply too vast, and the means available to him too limited. Into this atmosphere of desperation and dying hope came a man claiming to be Dmitri, the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, who had died in 1591 under circumstances that were officially called an accident and unofficially called almost everything else. If the real Dmitri had survived, and Boris Godunov had certainly been suspected of arranging his death, then Boris's throne was not merely questionable, but stolen. The pretender, known to history as the false Dmitri I, appeared in Poland in 1603, claiming to be the rightful Tsar of Russia. He had, conveniently, the support of a powerful Polish magnate and a small army. Now, a word about the false Dmitri. Historians still debate who he actually was. The most widely accepted theory is that he was a runaway monk named Grigory Otrepyev, but honestly, given the chaos of the period, he might have been anyone. What mattered was not his identity, but his usefulness to the various factions that saw in his claim a lever with which to pry Boris from the throne. Boris Godunov died in April 1605, possibly from a stroke, possibly from poison, possibly from the weight of everything that was happening to him. His son Fyodor briefly succeeded him, and was then murdered by boyars who opened Moscow to the false Dmitri. The pretender entered the city and was crowned Tsar, and for about 11 months he actually ruled Russia. He was intelligent, energetic, and apparently popular with many ordinary Muscovites. He was also, fatally, too attached to his Polish companions and his Polish Catholic wife, in a country where orthodoxy was not just a religion but an identity. In May 1606, a conspiracy of boyars led by Vasily Shuisky had him murdered. His body was burned and his ashes were loaded into a cannon and fired back toward Poland, which is one way to deal with a usurper. Vasily Shuisky was then elected Tsar by a gathering of boyars, which gave him legitimacy roughly comparable to that of Boris Godunov, which is to say, not very much. Almost immediately another pretender appeared, false Dmitri II, who was even less convincing than the first, but attracted a substantial following nonetheless, including bands of Cossacks, runaway serfs, and disaffected minor nobles. He established a rival court at Tushino, a village near Moscow, close enough that contemporaries simply called him the Tushino thief. Russia now had 2 Tsars, each controlling part of the country, while Poland and Sweden moved to take advantage of the chaos. Vasily Shuisky made the mistake of inviting Swedish military assistance, which gave Poland a pretext to declare open war. Polish forces defeated a Russian army at Klushino in 1610, and Vasily Shuisky was deposed and forced to become a monk, which in Russian political tradition was a convenient way of removing someone from the game without actually killing them. For a period, there was effectively no Russian Tsar at all. The boyars negotiated with the Polish king Sigismund III to place his son Ladislaw on the Russian throne, which tells you something about the level of desperation involved. Moscow was occupied by Polish forces. The Patriarch of Moscow, Hermogen, was imprisoned for refusing to sanction this arrangement. He would die in captivity in 1612, but not before writing letters smuggled out of his cell, urging Russians to resist the occupation. Those letters found their audience. Across Russia, a movement of national resistance began to organize. The figure most associated with it is Kuzma Minin, a butcher and merchant from Nizhny Novgorod, which is worth dwelling on for a moment, because in most historical narratives the people who save countries are princes and generals and great statesmen. Kuzma Minin was a butcher. He reportedly sold his own property and urged his fellow townsmen to do the same, saying that if we truly wish to help the Muscovite state, then we should not spare our property, nor our wives, nor our children. He was paired with Prince Dmitry Pozharsky, a military commander who had been recovering from wounds received in earlier fighting, and together they assembled a volunteer army. In October 1612, after months of siege, Minin and Pozharsky's forces took Moscow back from the Polish garrison. The victory was celebrated, the occupation ended, and Russia could begin to think about what came next. What came next required one essential thing. Russia needed a Tsar, not an elected substitute, not a foreign prince, not a pretender of uncertain identity, but a legitimate ruler with a credible claim to continuity with the Russian dynastic tradition. The Zemsky Sobor, the Assembly of the Land, was convened in Moscow in January 1613. With representatives from across the country, nobles, clergy, townspeople, even some representatives of the peasantry, an unusually broad gathering by the standards of the time, they considered various candidates. Foreign princes were proposed and rejected. Several Russian boyars put themselves forward and were rejected too, because everyone understood that choosing one boyar family over the others would simply restart the factional violence that had helped create the troubles in the first place. The name that emerged after much deliberation was Michael Romanov. He was 16 years old. His great-aunt had been the wife of Ivan the Terrible, which gave him a connection, however slender, to the old Rurik dynasty. His father, Filaret, was a prominent churchman. His family was respected, but not so powerful as to threaten the other boyar clans. He was, in other words, a compromise candidate, which is often exactly what a shattered country needs. When the delegation found him, Michael was at the Ipatiev monastery in Kostroma with his mother, the nun Marfa. The story goes that when told he had been chosen as Tsar, he wept. His mother wept. They refused for some time, saying he was too young, that the position was too dangerous, that Russia was in such a state that no one could govern it. The delegation reportedly prostrated themselves and begged. Eventually Michael and Marfa agreed. On March 21st, 1613, Michael Romanov accepted the throne of Russia. The Romanov dynasty had begun. It would last exactly 304 years. The rise of the Romanovs, a boy on a broken throne. Michael Romanov was not by any measure an imposing figure. He was slight, physically unwell for much of his life, and temperamentally cautious to the point of indecisiveness. He was not the kind of man you would look at and think, there is the ruler who will rebuild a shattered empire. And yet, in some ways, his very ordinariness was precisely what Russia needed in 1613. The country did not need a visionary. It needed someone who would simply hold the centre while the pieces were put back together. Let us be honest about the situation he inherited. Russia in 1613 was in a genuinely terrible state. Large parts of the country were still occupied by foreign forces or controlled by bandits and Cossack warlords who had been fighting various sides throughout the Troubles. The treasury was essentially empty. The infrastructure of the state, such as it had been, was damaged or destroyed. Whole regions had been depopulated by famine, plague, and violence. And the new Tsar himself was a teenager with no governing experience, whose father was a prisoner in Poland. That last point deserves emphasis. Filaret, Michael's father, had been made patriarch of the Orthodox Church before the Troubles, a position of enormous prestige. During the chaos, he had been captured by the Poles and held prisoner. He would not return to Russia until 1619, when a peace agreement with Poland secured his release. But when he did return, he became co-ruler in all but name, taking the title Patriarch and governing alongside his son with such authority that foreign diplomats sometimes addressed letters to both of them simultaneously. This father-son partnership was in many ways the real story of the early Romanov period. Michael provided the throne, the dynastic legitimacy, the symbol of continuity. Filaret provided the administrative capacity, the political experience, the actual governing. Together they were, if not exactly a formidable team, at least a functional one. The immediate priorities were straightforward, even if the execution was enormously difficult. Peace had to be made with Sweden and Poland, even at significant territorial cost. The Stolbovo peace with Sweden in 1617 resulted in Russia losing access to the Baltic Sea, which hurt. The Truce of Dulino with Poland in 1618 resulted in Russia ceding the Smolensk region and several other territories, which also hurt. But peace, even expensive peace, was preferable to continued war, and Michael's government was realistic enough to accept the terms on offer. Internally, the work of reconstruction was slow and unglamorous. The Zemski Sobor, the Assembly of the Land, continued to meet regularly in the early decades of Michael's reign, providing a degree of consultation between the government and various segments of Russian society. Tax collection was reorganized. Local administration was slowly rebuilt. The military was gradually reformed, with foreign officers brought in to help train new units along European lines. One of the persistent problems of this period was banditry. The Troubles had produced enormous numbers of armed men with no particular allegiance, and a strong disposition toward taking what they needed from whoever had it. Pacifying the countryside was a decade-long project, requiring both military force and the gradual restoration of enough civil order that ordinary people had some alternative to violence. The Orthodox Church played a crucial role in this process, not because the Church was especially political, though it certainly was, but because in the psychological devastation that followed the Troubles, people needed meaning. They needed a sense that Russia had been tested and had survived, that God had not abandoned them, that the time of troubles was a punishment now ended rather than a preview of permanent collapse. The Church provided that narrative, and Philaret as patriarch gave it institutional weight. It is also worth noting something about the psychology of Michael's position that is easy to underestimate. He had been chosen, not born to a throne that everyone assumed was his, but chosen, elevated by an assembly, accepted as a compromise. This created a subtle but important dynamic. The Romanovs in their earliest years owed something to the people who had selected them, or at least to the boyar families who had been central to that selection. Michael could not afford to be arbitrary or despotic in the way that Ivan the Terrible had been, at least not immediately, at least not openly. There was a degree of consultation, of engagement, that the earliest Romanovs maintained that later Romanovs would largely abandon. When Philaret died in 1633, Michael continued to rule, but with noticeably less energy. He relied heavily on favourites and advisers, and his health was increasingly poor. He died in 1645, having ruled for 32 years. By that point, Russia was not exactly thriving, but it was intact. The borders had been partially stabilised. The worst of the internal violence had been suppressed. The machinery of the state, however imperfect, was functioning. In the circumstances of 1613, that was actually an achievement. His son Alexis succeeded him. Alexis was 16 years old at his accession, the same age his father had been when he took the throne. The parallel was not lost on contemporaries, but before we get to Alexis, let us take a moment to notice what the early Romanov decades had established. They had established first that the dynasty was real and intended to last. The Zemski Sobor had been necessary to create legitimacy, but the Romanovs were already working to make it unnecessary in the future. Power was centralizing, not in dramatic declarations, but in the slow accumulation of administrative practice. Second, they had established that Russia's relationship with the rest of Europe was changing. The time of troubles had involved foreign intervention, foreign armies, even a briefly foreign Tsar. Russia had survived, but it had been shown its own vulnerability. The response would be, over the coming decades, a growing determination to learn from Europe without being dominated by it, to modernize selectively while maintaining Russian distinctiveness. Third, and perhaps most importantly for the long arc of this story, the Romanovs had established the principle that their dynasty was permanent, not chosen, not contingent, not subject to replacement at the next crisis, but permanent. This was crucial. Russia's political culture had been defined for centuries by the idea of a legitimate ruling line. The Rurikids had provided that line for 700 years. The Romanovs were going to provide it for the next 300. And they were going to start by building something bigger than anyone who elected that frightened 16-year-old in 1613 could possibly have imagined. There is a small historical footnote worth mentioning here. The Ipatiev monastery, where Michael Romanov wept when told he had to become Tsar, is not the last time the name Ipatiev appears in Romanov history. There is a house in Yekaterinburg, built by a man named Ipatiev. The Romanov story begins in an Ipatiev building and ends in one too. History has a sense of dark humour that borders on the unprofessional. Alexis the Quiet. Building the bones of empire. Alexis. Romanov is one of those historical figures who gets consistently overlooked, sandwiched as he is between the early struggling years of the dynasty on one side and the volcanic personality of his son Peter on the other. He is known to history as Alexis the Quiet, Tishaishi, which sounds like faint praise and is sometimes intended as exactly that. But the nickname conceals something important. Alexis reigned for 31 years, from 1645 to 1676. He was deeply religious, genuinely kind in his personal relationships, and possessed of a political intelligence that was more subtle than his reputation suggests. Under his reign, Russia changed in ways that would make Peter the Great's later revolution possible, and which were, in their own right, some of the most consequential developments in Russian history. Let us start with the law. In 1649, Alexis presided over the creation of the Sobornoye Uloženie, the Law Code, a comprehensive legal document that organized Russian law more systematically than anything that had come before. Among its provisions was one that would define Russian rural life for the next 2 centuries. The code made serfdom permanent and hereditary. Serfs were bound to the land and to their lords with no legal path to freedom. The time limit on pursuing runaway serfs was abolished entirely. This was not a small administrative detail. It was the formal legal enslavement of the majority of Russia's population. Why does this matter for the Romanov story? Because serfdom was the foundation upon which the Romanov Empire would be built. It provided the agricultural surplus that fed the cities, the tax base that funded the military, and the labour that built the roads and canals and fortifications that would define Russian imperial expansion. It also created a social wound that would never entirely heal, that would fuel peasant rebellions throughout the Romanov centuries, and that would ultimately contribute to the dynasty's destruction. When people try to understand why the Russian Revolution was as violent as it was, the answer runs in a direct line back to 1649. Alexis also presided over one of the most significant and traumatic religious disputes in Russian history, the Raskol, or Great Schism. The story begins with a churchman named Nikon, whom Alexis elevated to patriarch in 1652. Nikon was a reformer, determined to correct what he saw as errors that had crept into Russian Orthodox practice over the centuries. He revised the liturgical books, changed certain ritual practices, and generally brought Russian Orthodoxy into closer alignment with Greek Orthodox tradition. The reaction was explosive. A substantial portion of Russian society, cutting across all classes, refused to accept the changes. These old believers, as they came to be called, argued that the old rituals were sacred and that altering them was a form of sacrilege. They were willing to die for this conviction, and many of them did, some in government executions and some in mass self-immolations as entire communities burned themselves rather than accept what they saw as a corrupted faith. The Great Schism was never fully healed during the Romanov period. The old believers were persecuted, marginalized, and driven to the edges of Russian society, where they maintained their practices with extraordinary tenacity. Even today there are old believer communities that preserve liturgical forms from before 1652. The schism was also significant for the political relationship between church and state, because Nikon overreached. He claimed that the church's authority was superior to the Tsars in spiritual matters, and that he, the patriarch, was therefore effectively co-ruler. Alexis, who had genuinely loved Nikon in their early friendship, eventually had enough and manoeuvred to have Nikon removed from his position. It was a messy, protracted process, but it ended with the principle firmly established that the Tsar's authority was supreme, even over the church. This would be important context for what Peter the Great would do to the church's institutional independence a generation later. On the foreign policy front, Alexis's reign saw Russia make one of its most significant territorial acquisitions. In 1648 and 1654, the Cossack Hetmanate of Ukraine, which had been in revolt against Polish rule, offered to accept the overlordship of Moscow. The Pereyaslav Agreement of 1654 formalized this arrangement. It was the beginning of Russia's relationship with Ukraine, a relationship that was at various moments a partnership, a domination, a union, and a source of conflict, and which would ultimately contribute to the collapse of the Soviet successor state to the Romanovs centuries later. History is complicated. Alexis also fought wars with Poland and Sweden, winning back Smolensk and several other territories lost during the time of troubles. Russia was not yet the dominant power in Eastern Europe, but it was growing slowly and continuously in a direction that suggested it would be. Internally, Alexis's reign was marked by periodic upheaval. In 1648, there were urban riots across Russia, including in Moscow itself, provoked by tax increases and economic grievances. In 1662, the copper coin revolt erupted when the government tried to pay its debts by issuing copper coins at the same value as silver, causing rapid inflation. And in 1670 to 1671, the Great Cossack and Peasant Rebellion led by Stenka Razin swept across the Volga region, requiring a major military effort to suppress. Razin's rebellion is worth pausing on for a moment, because it prefigured so much of what would follow. Stenka Razin, a Don Cossack, built a following of runaway serfs, dispossessed minor nobles, non-Russian peoples of the Volga, and various other people who had good reasons to be angry with the existing order. His forces captured several major cities along the Volga and held them for months. The government's eventual defeat of his forces was followed by an execution of theatrical brutality. Razin was publicly tortured and torn apart by horses in Moscow as a demonstration of what happened to people who challenged Romanov authority. But the demonstration never fully worked. The conditions that had produced Razin would produce Pugachev a century later, and the conditions that produced Pugachev would produce the revolution that ended the dynasty. The grievances of the Russian peasantry were not resolved by executing their leaders. They were simply deferred. Alexis died in 1676, leaving behind a state that was larger, more organized, more coherent, and more deeply divided than the one he had inherited. He also left behind a tangle of family politics, because he had 2 wives and children from each of them, which would create exactly the kind of succession conflicts that destabilized dynasties. The first 2 sons who succeeded him, Fyodor III and then Ivan V, who ruled jointly with the young Peter in the 1680s, were not remarkable rulers, but they bridged the gap between Alexis and the person this story has been building towards since the beginning. Peter Alexeyevich, the Great. And he is going to need his own chapter, because he is genuinely one of the most remarkable and one of the most disturbing human beings who ever sat on a throne. Peter the Great, the Tsar who tried to drag Russia into the future. Let me tell you about Peter. Peter was born in 1672, the 14th child of Alexis by his second wife. He was large at birth, and he just kept going. By adulthood, he stood approximately 6 feet 8 inches tall, which in the 17th century made him not so much a man as a geographical feature. He was extraordinarily energetic, physically restless, intellectually curious about almost everything, and utterly incapable of sitting still. He could work a ship's lathe, fire a cannon, pull a tooth, and perform surgery, all with genuine competence. He was also capable of extreme cruelty, of drinking himself and his companions into states of spectacular degradation, and of executing people with a personal involvement that most monarchs preferred to delegate. He was, in short, a force of nature. Russia had never seen anything quite like him, and it is fair to say that Russia was not entirely sure it wanted to. Peter's early years were marked by the turbulent politics of the Romanov court. When his father Alexis died in 1676, Peter was only 3 years old. His half-brother Fyodor became Tsar and died in 1682. Then came the Streltsy Revolt, a rebellion by the old palace guard that was really a power struggle between the families of Alexis's 2 sets of children. In the violence that followed, young Peter, then 10 years old, watched members of his mother's family being killed. He reportedly watched from a window as soldiers seized and murdered the men who had been protecting his family. This experience left marks that never faded. Peter's later relationship with the Streltsy, the palace guard who had been the instrument of those deaths, was one of profound and eventually murderous hostility. After the revolt, effective power fell to Peter's half-sister Sophia, who acted as regent for both Peter and his half-brother Ivan, who was partially blind and cognitively impaired. Sophia was actually a capable ruler and governed reasonably well for 7 years. But Peter was growing up, and when he and his supporters moved against her in 1689, she was sent to a convent, which was, again, the traditional Russian solution to politically inconvenient women. Ivan continued to be co-Tsar in a largely ceremonial capacity until his death in 1696. From that point, Peter ruled alone. He was 24 years old, and he was about to begin one of the most extraordinary reigns in European history. Peter's central conviction was that Russia was falling behind Western Europe in military technology, in naval power, in manufacturing, in science, in administration. He was right about this. The gap that had opened up during the previous century, as Western Europe went through the scientific revolution, the development of professional standing armies, the growth of commercial empires, was real and growing. Russia was a vast country with enormous resources, and an army that fought largely with 17th century methods against opponents who were already in the 18th century. Peter was determined to close that gap. His method was characteristically direct. In 1697 and 1698, he led what was called the Grand Embassy, an enormous diplomatic mission to Western Europe, ostensibly to build alliances against the Ottoman Empire, but really to study everything he could study. He travelled incognito, which fooled nobody given that he was almost 7 feet tall, but the fiction was maintained. He worked in Dutch shipyards, visited English factories, studied anatomy with Dutch doctors, met scientists and engineers and architects and naval officers. He absorbed everything he could, and he came back to Russia with plans. The plans were ambitious to the point of mania. He wanted a navy. Russia had essentially no naval tradition, so he would build one. He wanted a new capital, modern, European-facing on the Baltic coast that he had not yet even conquered. He wanted a reorganized army trained by European officers. He wanted new administrative structures. He wanted the calendar reformed. He wanted the church brought under state control. He wanted the boyars to shave their beards and wear European clothes. He actually stood in the doorway of parties and personally cut the beards off noblemen who arrived wearing them, which must have been an unusual experience even by the standards of Romanov social occasions. The Great Northern War, which Peter fought against Sweden from 1700 to 1721, was the crucible in which his new Russia was tested. Sweden at the time was one of the dominant military powers in Europe, controlling most of the Baltic coastline and commanded by one of history's more remarkable generals, the young King Charles XII. The war began catastrophically for Russia. At the Battle of Narva in 1700, a Swedish force of around 8,000 men defeated a Russian army of roughly 40,000 in a battle that lasted only a few hours. It was a humiliation. Peter's response was to work harder. He melted down church bells to cast new cannons. He reorganized, retrained, and re-equipped his army. He studied what had gone wrong at Narva and built military institutions designed to prevent it happening again. When the two sides met again at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, the result was entirely different. The Swedish army was destroyed. Charles XII fled to the Ottoman Empire. Russia had won definitively the dominant position in the Baltic that Peter had always sought. The victory at Poltava was transformational. It confirmed Russia as a major European power in a way that could no longer be dismissed or ignored. The Treaty of Nystad in 1721 formalized Russia's acquisition of Estonia, Latvia and part of Finland, giving it the Baltic coastline Peter had always coveted. He celebrated by taking the titles Emperor and Great, the first Russian ruler to use either. St. Petersburg, which Peter had begun building on the swampy Baltic shore in 1703, was his great statement to Europe and to his own people. He literally built a city out of nothing, on land that flooded regularly, in a climate that was harsh even by Russian standards, using the forced labour of tens of thousands of serfs, many of whom died in the construction. He moved the Russian capital there from Moscow, a decision that his successors would not reverse for over 2 centuries. St. Petersburg was everything Moscow was not. It was planned, rational, geometric. Its palaces and canals were modelled on Amsterdam and Venice. It looked west, not east, and that was entirely the point. Peter also reformed the church in a way that Nikon had tried and failed to achieve through personal authority. When the Patriarch of Moscow died in 1700, Peter simply did not appoint a successor. Instead, he eventually established the Holy Synod in 1721, a committee of churchmen appointed by and answerable to the state. The church was effectively nationalized. Its institutional independence ended. The Patriarch of Moscow would not be re-established until 1917, which seems like an oversight by the universe in terms of timing. The administrative reforms were equally sweeping. Peter replaced the old Boyar Council with a Senate. He divided Russia into provinces governed by appointed officials. He created a table of ranks that theoretically made advancement in government service dependent on merit rather than birth, though in practice birth still helped. He expanded and reformed taxation. He created new schools, a new Academy of Sciences, a printing press for secular books. Russia was being rebuilt almost from the ground up, and the cost was staggering. Not in money, though the wars and construction projects cost enormous amounts of that too, but in human terms. The serfs who built St. Petersburg, the soldiers who died at Narva and Poltava, and in the other campaigns of the Great Northern War, the people whose labour was extracted through increasingly heavy taxation, paid for Peter's transformation in blood and exhaustion. The old Russia, with its Byzantine rhythms and its comfortable conviction that it was spiritually superior to the corrupt West, was dismantled. What replaced it was something new and powerful and deeply unsettling to many of its inhabitants. His son Alexis, his heir, represented everything Peter had rejected. Alexis was religious, conservative, attached to the old ways. Father and son were, by the time Alexis reached adulthood, essentially at war. The situation came to a head in 1717 when Alexis fled to the Habsburg Empire, which was a dramatic way of expressing disagreement with one's father's policies. Peter lured him back with promises of amnesty, and then had him arrested and tried for treason. Under torture, Alexis confessed to essentially everything he was accused of, and possibly some things he had not actually thought of. He died in the Peter and Paul fortress in 1718, officially of the effects of interrogation, which is the kind of official explanation that everyone understands the meaning of. Peter, who had killed his son, died in 1725 after an illness apparently aggravated by his habit of diving into freezing water to help rescue sailors from a foundering ship. He was 52 years old and had not clearly designated a successor, which left Russia with an immediate succession crisis, because that is the kind of thing Peter would do. He was, genuinely, one of the most consequential rulers in Russian history. He had transformed Russia from a regional power into a European empire, had built a navy from nothing, had made St. Petersburg one of the great cities of the world, had created the institutional framework of a modern state. He had also tortured his son to death, worked tens of thousands of serfs to death building his dream city, and created a society so transformed from what it had been that a substantial portion of his population spent the next several decades wondering what exactly had happened to them. Russia would never go back to what it had been before Peter. For better and worse, and it was genuinely both, that was his legacy. The age of palace revolutions, when women ruled Russia. Peter the Great died without a clear male heir of adult age, and without, in the typical Romanov fashion, having sorted out what should happen next. What followed was several decades of extraordinary instability in which the Russian throne changed hands repeatedly, usually with the assistance of palace guards, and usually to the benefit of women. This period, from 1725 to 1762, is sometimes called the Age of Palace Revolutions, and it has a quality of operatic chaos that is both alarming and, at a safe historical distance, rather entertaining. The Guards regiments that Peter had created as elite military units turned out to be the decisive factor in who actually sat on the throne. Whoever could secure their loyalty controlled Russia, and their loyalty, it turned out, was available, given the right combination of personal charisma, political promises, and conveniently available alcohol. Peter was succeeded immediately by his second wife, Catherine I. This Catherine, not to be confused with the more famous Catherine who would come later, had an origin story that reads like a novel of the more implausible variety. Born in Lithuania, possibly a peasant girl taken as a prisoner of war, passed through the households of several Russian officers before coming to Peter's attention. She eventually married him in a ceremony in 1712. She was energetic, cheerful, apparently genuinely fond of Peter, and utterly unprepared to actually govern Russia. Real power was exercised by a Supreme Privy Council dominated by Prince Alexander Menshikov, Peter's longtime favourite and one of the more staggering success stories of the table of ranks in action, a man who had reportedly started life as a street vendor selling meat pies. Catherine died in 1727 after only 2 years on the throne. Her successor was Peter II, the 12-year-old grandson of Peter the Great, who then died of smallpox in 1730 at the age of 14 before he could do very much of anything. Peter II was the last male descendant of Peter the Great in the direct line, which created another succession crisis. The Supreme Privy Council, seeking to limit the power of whoever came next, offered the throne to Anna of Courland, Peter the Great's niece, with conditions attached. She was to share power with the council, not make war or peace without their approval, not raise taxes, and not marry or appoint a successor without their consent. Anna agreed to the conditions, arrived in Moscow, and then, with the support of the noble gentry who were terrified of being dominated by the 8 council members, tore up the conditions and resumed autocratic rule. Anna's reign from 1730 to 1740 is not exactly remembered as a golden age. She was unpopular partly because she surrounded herself with Baltic German courtiers, which offended Russian national sentiment, and partly because her regime was associated with a political terror conducted by a secret police organization that sent thousands to Siberia. She was also personally given to rather crude entertainments, of which the most notorious was arranging a court wedding between 2 jesters in an ice palace specially constructed for the purpose on the frozen Neva River in 1740. A building that melted in the spring, which is either a metaphor or just a story about ice. Anna died in 1740 after nominating her infant great-nephew Ivan as successor, with Ernst Johann Byron, her German favourite, as regent. Ivan VI was deposed after only a year by the Guards, who transferred their support to Elizabeth, Peter the Great's daughter. Ivan spent the rest of his life in solitary confinement and was killed in 1764 by his Guards when a rescue attempt triggered their standing orders to prevent his liberation. He had spent 23 years in a cell. He was 23 years old when he was killed, having been imprisoned since he was an infant. This is one of those facts from Russian history that is genuinely difficult to sit with. Elizabeth, who ruled from 1741 to 1762, was a more appealing character. She was Peter the Great's daughter, and had absorbed something of his energy and his love of display, without quite acquiring his administrative genius. Her court was magnificent. She built the Winter Palace as we know it today, and she had a genuine sense of Russian national pride that made her more popular than her Germanic predecessors. She abolished the death penalty in Russia, which was a genuine reform, though the use of torture, exile, and various other less terminal but still severe punishments continued vigorously. Culturally, Elizabeth's reign saw the founding of Moscow University in 1755 and the development of a distinctly Russian cultural life that had been somewhat suppressed by Peter's insistence on European models. But Elizabeth had no legitimate children, and her chosen successor was her nephew Peter III, who turned out to be one of the worst choices in the history of dynastic succession, which in Russia means it was competing with a very full field. Peter III was German by upbringing and disposition, an admirer of Frederick the Great of Prussia to the point of apparent obsession, who became Tsar of Russia in January 1762 and immediately made several decisions that horrified most of his subjects. He withdrew Russia from the 7 Years' War just when Frederick the Great was nearly defeated, surrendering Russia's enormous military advantage in exchange for nothing. He prepared to go to war against Denmark on behalf of his personal Holstein holdings, which were of interest to approximately nobody in Russia. He made no secret of his contempt for the Orthodox Church and for Russian culture generally. He also had a wife, and she was paying attention. Catherine the Great, ambition without apology. Catherine II, known to posterity as Catherine the Great, was not Russian by birth. She was born Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, the daughter of a minor German prince. She came to Russia at the age of 15 to marry the heir to the Russian throne, converted to Orthodoxy, learned to speak Russian with near-native fluency, and spent the next several decades absorbing everything she could about the country she had arrived in as a stranger. By the time she orchestrated the coup that removed her husband from the throne in July 1762, she had been in Russia for 17 years, had read voraciously in French, the language of European intellectual life, had corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot and other luminaries of the Enlightenment, and had concluded that her husband was going to destroy everything she had worked to build and possibly take her with him. The coup of 1762 was a masterclass in political theatre. Catherine rode out to greet the Guards regiments that she had cultivated, with a combination of personal attention and careful alliance building, dressed in a Guards uniform herself, and they acclaimed her empress. Peter III abdicated 6 days later and died shortly afterward in circumstances that were, once again, officially described as a medical event, but were widely understood as something more direct. Catherine was not directly involved in his death, most historians believe, but she was not unhappy about it either. Catherine ruled alone for 34 years, from 1762 to 1796. Her reign is, by almost any measure, one of the most significant in Russian history. She was a genuine intellectual, not in the decorative sense of a monarch who liked to be seen with clever people, but in the substantive sense of someone who read seriously, thought seriously, and tried to apply the ideas she encountered to the problems she faced. She had absorbed the Enlightenment's faith in reason, in law, in the possibility of improvement through education and rational governance. She corresponded with the philosophes of France as an equal, which they found flattering, and which she used skillfully to build Russia's international reputation. Her early reign produced the Nakaz, or Instruction, a remarkable document that laid out her vision for legal and social reform. It drew extensively on Montesquieu and other Enlightenment thinkers, argued for the rule of law, for equality before the courts, for the limitation of torture. It was genuinely forward-looking. It also had essentially no effect, because the legislative commission she convened to turn the Nakaz's principles into actual laws eventually dissolved without producing a comprehensive legal code. The gap between Catherine's philosophical ideals and the realities of Russian governance was wide, and events would widen it further. Those events centered on Pugachev. In 1773 to 1775, a Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev launched the largest peasant rebellion in Russian history. He claimed to be Peter III, miraculously survived, returned to claim his throne and free the serfs. He attracted an army of hundreds of thousands of disaffected people, serfs, Cossacks, workers from the Ural factories, non-Russian peoples of the steppe, and for a time he controlled enormous stretches of southeastern Russia. The rebellion was suppressed with extreme violence, and Pugachev was brought to Moscow and executed in 1775. But the experience shook Catherine profoundly. Whatever Enlightenment sympathies she had for the theoretical freedom of serfs, Pugachev had shown her what the practical consequences of disrupting the existing social order might look like. She did not free the serfs. She actually extended serfdom further in the Ukrainian territories absorbed into Russia during her reign. The noble class, which had supported her and whose cooperation she needed, was confirmed in its privileges. The gentry received a charter of nobility in 1785 that enshrined their rights and exempted them from mandatory state service, creating a legally privileged class of a kind that other European enlightened monarchs were trying to limit. This was the central paradox of Catherine's reign. She genuinely believed in Enlightenment principles and genuinely governed as an autocrat who depended on an enslaved peasantry. She was not simply a hypocrite. She was navigating a genuine impossibility, trying to modernize a society without disturbing the economic and social foundations that made its existing order function. She never solved this problem. Arguably, no Russian ruler did, right up until the dynasty ended. In foreign policy, Catherine was brilliant. She fought 2 successful wars against the Ottoman Empire, acquiring the northern shore of the Black Sea, the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed in 1783, and opening the Black Sea to Russian commerce for the first time. Her general Suvorov and her admiral Ushakov won victories that made Russia the dominant power in the Black Sea region for the first time in its history. She participated in 3 partitions of Poland alongside Prussia and Austria in 1772, 1793 and 1795, carving up what had once been Europe's largest state and dividing it among the 3 neighbouring empires. Poland ceased to exist as an independent state as a result. This was one of those foreign policy achievements that looks impressive on a map and creates problems for the next 2 centuries. Russia incorporated huge numbers of Polish, Lithuanian, Jewish, and other non-Russian subjects, adding to the ethnic and cultural complexity of an empire that was already almost impossible to administer consistently. Domestically, Catherine founded schools, hospitals, orphanages, the Smolny Institute for Noble Girls, which was one of the first formal educational institutions for women in Russia. She expanded and rebuilt cities, imported Western art on a massive scale, founding the Hermitage collection that would become one of the world's great museums. She patronized Russian literature and theatre. She was, by any standard, a great patron of culture. She was also personally complicated in ways that her contemporaries gossiped about extensively, and that later historians have had to navigate carefully. She had a series of significant relationships throughout her reign, with Grigory Orlov, who had been central to the coup that brought her to power, with Grigory Potemkin, who was probably the love of her life and certainly the most significant political partner of her reign, and with a series of later favourites who were younger and whose political influence was more limited. These relationships were used against her reputation by her enemies, both at the time and later. The truth is that Catherine managed her personal life with much the same pragmatic intelligence she brought to everything else, and several of her favourites, particularly Potemkin, were genuinely talented men who contributed significantly to Russia's expansion and development. Grigory Potemkin deserves a brief moment because he is one of the more fascinating figures in Romanov history. He was a general, an administrator, a colonizer of the newly acquired southern territories, and according to most accounts a genuinely extraordinary personality. He governed the new southern provinces, building cities, establishing the Black Sea Fleet, attempting to settle and develop territories that had previously been steppe. The phrase Potemkin village, meaning an impressive facade concealing nothing behind it, was invented by his enemies to suggest that his achievements were all show. Historians have spent considerable energy demonstrating that this was largely unfair. His achievements were real. The facade, where it existed, was less egregious than the phrase suggests. Catherine died in November 1796. She had not, in the end, named her grandson Alexander as her successor over her son Paul, though she had apparently intended to and simply ran out of time. Paul had been waiting for the throne for 34 years, growing increasingly resentful and increasingly unstable. When he finally became emperor, the results were predictable. Her legacy was immense. She had expanded Russia's territory dramatically, consolidated its position as a great European power, built cultural institutions that transformed Russian intellectual life, and left behind a state that was richer and more powerful than the one she had inherited. She had also confirmed serfdom as the social foundation of the empire, left unresolved the central contradiction between autocracy and enlightenment, and created a noble class confident in its privileges and its ability to manage succession in its own interests. These were gifts to the future that would keep giving in the worst possible ways. But for now, in the closing years of the 18th century, Russia was Catherine's Russia, and that was no small thing. Paul, Alexander, and the shadow of Napoleon, Paul I has a reputation as the Mad Tsar, and while that designation is probably too simple, it is not entirely unfair. He had waited 34 years for power, years in which he'd been excluded from any meaningful role by his mother, years in which his resentment had curdled into something genuinely strange. He became Tsar in 1796 and was assassinated in 1801, giving him exactly 4 years and 4 months to do as much damage as possible, which was apparently sufficient. The thing about Paul is that he was not unintelligent. He had ideas about how Russia should be governed, clear ones, and he pursued them with considerable energy. The problem was that his ideas were shaped less by any coherent political philosophy than by a burning need to undo everything his mother had done. Catherine the Great had excluded him from power for 34 years. He had watched from the sidelines while she governed, fought wars, acquired territories, patronized the arts, corresponded with Voltaire, and generally conducted herself as one of the most formidable rulers in Europe. Whether his resentment of her was primarily personal or political is probably an unanswerable question, since in Paul's case the two things seem to have been thoroughly inseparable. He reversed much of what Catherine had done, which appeared to be the point. He restored mandatory state service for the nobility, which Catherine had abolished. He restricted the authority of the provincial assemblies she had created. He curtailed the liberties she had granted to the noble class under the Charter of Nobility. Each reversal was framed as a correction of her errors, a restoration of proper order, but the pattern was so consistent and so comprehensive that it was difficult to see it as anything other than what it was, a son systematically destroying his mother's legacy. He developed an obsession with military parade that went beyond the normal royal interest in military ceremony and into something closer to mania. His model was the Prussian army of Frederick the Great, and in St. Petersburg this meant soldiers drilling in freezing temperatures to satisfy standards that were exacting, inflexible, and enforced with punishments severe enough that officers and men alike went to considerable lengths to avoid his attention. He would dismiss officers on the spot for imperfections in their uniforms or for a drill movement executed half a beat too slowly. The Guards regiments, which had been the traditional support of the Romanov throne through the preceding decades of palace revolutions, found themselves subjected to humiliations they had not anticipated and did not absorb quietly. His foreign policy lurched in contradictory directions that are difficult to follow even with the benefit of hindsight and a good map. He was initially hostile to revolutionary France, joining coalitions against it in the manner of any conservative European monarch of the period. Then, after a series of military disappointments and a growing personal admiration for Napoleon Bonaparte, he swung to something close to enthusiasm for the first consul. This produced the most spectacular episode of his foreign policy, a plan to jointly invade British India with French forces crossing through the Middle East, while Russian Cossacks approached from Central Asia. When news of this project reached the British, they were understandably alarmed. It was not a serious military plan in any practical sense, but it was the kind of thing that made everyone, allies and adversaries alike, wonder whether the Tsar of Russia was entirely reliable as a strategic partner. He alienated his military. He alienated his nobles. He alienated his family, including his son Alexander, who was aware, with increasing discomfort, of the plots that were forming around him. In March 1801, a group of Guards officers who had simply had enough assassinated Paul in his bedroom at the Michael Castle in St. Petersburg. The castle, incidentally, was a new building that Paul had constructed, partly because he was afraid of being murdered at the Winter Palace. He moved into the Michael Castle in February and was killed there in March, which suggests that his instinct for self-preservation, while not entirely wrong in its diagnosis, left something to be desired in its timing. Paul was strangled and beaten with a snuff box, which is an undignified end for any monarch. The assassination took place with the apparent foreknowledge, if not the direct involvement, of his son Alexander, who was in the castle that night. Whether Alexander was told that his father would be forced to abdicate, or whether he understood that the plan involved killing him, is one of those historical questions that the surviving evidence cannot definitively resolve. What is beyond dispute is that Alexander became Tsar that night, and that the knowledge of how he became Tsar, the guilt of it, buried but never quite absent, would haunt him for the rest of his life in ways that shaped his personality and his reign in directions neither he nor anyone around him fully understood. Alexander I, who reigned from 1801 to 1825, was one of the most complex and ultimately tragic figures in the entire Romanov dynasty. He was charming in the way that genuinely clever people sometimes are, effortlessly, almost dangerously, because the charm made it easy to believe that the intelligence behind it was also effortless, and therefore trustworthy, and therefore reliable. He was well educated, genuinely drawn to liberal ideals, interested in constitutional arrangements and the rights of man and all the things that the Enlightenment had put into circulation in educated European minds. He was also, when the moment came to act on any of these convictions, constitutionally unable to translate them into lasting policy. His reign was dominated, as much of Europe's first 2 decades of the 19th century was dominated, by Napoleon. The two men were in many ways mirror images of each other. Both had come to power young, both were charismatic, both were leaders of extraordinary intelligence who had emerged from the specific turbulences of the post-revolutionary moment, and both embodied in their very different ways the central contradiction of their age, the tension between the promise of a new order and the practical requirements of power. They met at Tilsit in 1807, on a raft moored in the middle of the Niemen River, after Napoleon had defeated the Russian and Prussian armies with devastating efficiency at Austerlitz in 1805 and Friedland in 1807. The meeting was elaborate in its staging, flattering to both parties in its choreography, and resulted in an agreement that divided European influence between them. France would dominate the West. Russia would have a free hand in the East and North. They embraced, reportedly, with apparent warmth. Alexander came back from Tilsit presenting himself as Napoleon's partner in remaking the European order, and for a few years the alliance held, or at least the appearance of it held, which in diplomacy often amounts to the same thing. What ended it was partly the continental system, Napoleon's attempt to starve Britain economically by closing European ports to British trade, which hurt the Russian economy severely and which Alexander ultimately refused to enforce. And partly it was simply the nature of two ambitious powers sharing a continent. The logic of their situations pushed them toward collision regardless of their personal inclinations. Napoleon invaded Russia in June 1812 with the Grande Armée, the largest military force assembled in European history up to that point, somewhere in the range of 600,000 men drawn from across his empire and his satellite states. The campaign that followed became one of the defining episodes of the Romanov story and of European history more broadly. The Russian army retreated. This was partly strategy and partly necessity. Since the Russian forces were substantially smaller than what Napoleon had assembled, Napoleon advanced, winning battles, taking cities, unable to destroy the Russian army in the decisive engagement he needed, and unable to force the capitulation that would end the war on his terms. Moscow itself, the ancient capital, was abandoned as Napoleon approached. The city burned in the days that followed his arrival, whether by Russian patriots, who preferred it empty and ash to occupied and intact, or by accident, or by some combination remains debated. Napoleon sat in the Kremlin, in the city that had been the heart of Russia for centuries, and waited for the peace offer that would confirm his victory. It never came. Alexander, advised by the extraordinary strategic mind of Field Marshal Kutuzov and by councillors who understood Russian geography and Russian winter in ways that Napoleon and his staff apparently did not, simply refused to negotiate. He had made himself personally synonymous with resistance and understood correctly that Russia's size was itself a weapon. There was always more Russia to retreat into. There was always a winter coming. The Grande Armée retreated from Moscow in October 1812, and the retreat became a catastrophe. The Russian winter and the relentless pursuit by Russian forces and the Cossacks harassing the flanks and the sheer impossibility of supplying and feeding 600,000 men across the Russian landscape turned what had been the greatest army in European history into a column of freezing, starving men struggling toward a border they had crossed 6 months earlier in confidence. Of the roughly 600,000 who invaded, perhaps 100,000 returned. The rest were dead, captured, or had simply vanished into the vast Russian landscape that had swallowed them. Napoleon's power in Europe was broken by the Russian campaign, though he would fight for 2 more years before the final defeat. For Russia, the victory was transformative in ways that went beyond the military. The army that pursued the French westward travelled through Poland, through Germany, through France itself. The officers who commanded it, many of them educated young men from the noble gentry, saw how Europeans lived, how they organised themselves, what ideas were circulating. They saw the aftermath of the French Revolution. They saw constitutional governments. They saw countries where the relationship between ruler and ruled operated according to different principles than the autocracy they had grown up under. When they came home, they came back with questions. They had gone to defend the Russian autocracy, and they returned wondering whether the Russian autocracy was the best possible system. Alexander's response to the post-Napoleonic moment was deeply contradictory, perhaps the most characteristic thing about him. He briefly considered constitutions, toyed with reform projects, participated in the Congress of Vienna, where he was one of the most significant figures in reshaping post-Napoleonic Europe, and adopted a posture of Christian mysticism that led him to help found the Holy Alliance, a vague agreement among the major powers to govern their relations according to Christian principles, which in practice meant supporting existing thrones against any revolutionary pressure and gave the great powers a convenient ideological justification for suppressing the liberal movements that were stirring across Europe. His later years grew more and more repressive. The early liberal gestures were abandoned. The reforming impulses retreated. It was as though the gap between what Alexander had always said he believed and what he was actually doing had become too uncomfortable to sustain, and he resolved the discomfort not by closing the gap through action, but by drawing back from everything that made the gap visible. The mysticism deepened. The clarity receded. He died in Taganrog in November 1825, officially of typhus, in circumstances that gave rise to one of the more persistent legends of the Romanov period. The story circulated almost immediately that Alexander had not died at all, that he had staged his death and gone to live out his days as a wandering holy man named Fyodor Kuzmich, seeking in obscurity and religious devotion the peace that power had denied him. This is almost certainly not true. The evidence for it is thin and the counter-evidence is substantial. But it is the kind of legend that attaches itself to figures who seemed, in their final years, to be exhausted by the performance of being themselves, by the distance between the person they presented and the person they actually were. His death without a clearly established male heir, a result of his own characteristic failure to resolve anything definitively, produced the Decembrist revolt of December 1825, a group of reform-minded military officers, exactly the kind of men who had returned from Paris with questions, attempted to use the moment of succession uncertainty to force a constitutional settlement. They gathered their soldiers in Senate Square in St. Petersburg and refused to swear allegiance to the new Tsar. The revolt was suppressed within hours by the man who would become Nicholas I, who turned out to be entirely unlike Alexander in temperament, in conviction, and in his approach to the relationship between questions and answers. Nicholas had an answer for the questions that the Decembrists were asking, and his answer was cannon fire. He would spend the next 30 years making very sure that nobody asked those questions again. Nicholas the Iron Tsar in the Frozen Empire. Nicholas I looked like a Tsar. This is not an entirely trivial point. He was tall, imposing, physically magnificent in the theatrical way that autocrats found useful, with a bearing that suggested he had been specifically manufactured for the role, which in a dynastic sense he had been, though not quite the role he ended up in. He was not supposed to be Tsar at all. He was the third son of Paul I, with 2 older brothers ahead of him in the succession, and he had been raised and educated accordingly, which in practice meant a military education focused on parade and engineering rather than the governance of a vast empire. When he came to the throne in December 1825, he was 29 years old and had been given essentially no preparation for what he was about to do. He cultivated an image of implacable authority and deployed it with considerable skill. The image was not entirely false. He was genuinely disciplined, genuinely hard-working in the exhausting administrative sense that governing Russia required, and genuinely convinced that his role was not merely political but divinely ordained. He was also, and this is the thing that makes his reign so simultaneously impressive and maddening to think about, one of the more intelligent men to sit on the Russian throne. A man of his intelligence, given his position, might have used it very differently. He chose not to, and that choice echoed through everything that followed. Nicholas came to the throne with the Decembrist revolt literally happening around him in the streets and squares of St. Petersburg. He had known about the conspiracy beforehand, had received warnings, and had done nothing to defuse the situation, perhaps because he was not yet Tsar, perhaps because he did not know how, perhaps because some part of him understood that facing it directly would be more useful than preventing it quietly. When the Liberal officers gathered in Senate Square on December 14th, refusing to swear allegiance to the new Tsar and demanding instead a constitution and the abolition of serfdom, Nicholas rode out personally to confront them. There was something almost theatrical about it. The new Tsar on horseback, facing down men who had fought Napoleon, who carried genuine ideals along with their muskets, who represented a segment of educated Russia that had come back from Western Europe with questions the autocracy had no intention of answering. After hours of standoff, with the winter afternoon darkening around them and various attempts at negotiation going nowhere, Nicholas ordered cannon fire. The grape shots scattered the crowd. The revolt was broken within minutes. 5 of its leaders were hanged, the first executions in Russia in decades, a deliberate signal about the character of the new reign. Dozens more were sent to Siberia, where they became something the new Tsar had probably not intended them to become. They became martyrs. They became revered figures in the emerging Russian liberal tradition, proof that people had cared enough about freedom to die for it. The Decembrists in their Siberian exile were somehow more politically potent than they had ever been in Senate Square with their muskets. Nicholas drew from the experience the lesson that reform was dangerous. He was not entirely wrong, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment before simply dismissing his conservatism as stupidity. The Decembrists had been a small group, but they had been drawn from the educated noble officer class, the very people whose cooperation the government needed to function. If Enlightenment ideas were already producing revolutionary conspiracies among the officer corps, then the logical conclusion was that more education and more exposure to Western liberalism would produce more radical demands and eventually more violence. Nicholas's solution was to keep the lid on as tightly as possible for as long as possible, to manage information so carefully that dangerous ideas could not circulate freely enough to find each other and combine into something explosive. His instrument for this was the Third Section, a political police organization established in 1826. It was the first major institution of systematic state surveillance in Russia, and Nicholas designed it with the personal attention that he gave to anything he considered important. It monitored correspondence, reading letters to and from suspected individuals with a thoroughness that required a substantial bureaucracy of readers. It infiltrated organizations, placing agents in clubs and literary circles and reform societies. It tracked the movements and activities of anyone deemed potentially suspicious, which in practice meant anyone who thought independently about political questions. Nicholas read its reports personally, regularly, carefully, a Tsar sitting at his desk in the Winter Palace, working through accounts of what his subjects were saying to each other in private. There is something in that image that is both dedicated and deeply sad. The Third Section became the ancestor of the Okhrana, and the Okhrana the ancestor of institutions whose names history has made familiar in ways that Nicholas would not have found entirely comfortable. He thought of surveillance as protection, as the rational management of a dangerous situation. He did not think of it as the first institutional expression of something that could grow into something far darker. Most people who build the foundations of terrible things do not think of them that way. Nicholas's Russia was the most censored, most bureaucratically controlled, most systematically policed Russia that had yet existed. Writers submitted their work to censors before publication, and the censors operated with anxious attention to anything that might be construed as criticism of the government, the church, or the social order. University curricula were approved by the state, and philosophy was periodically removed from the curriculum entirely on the grounds that it tended to produce dangerous conclusions. Travel abroad required official permission, and was not always granted. The phrase that became the official ideology of his reign was coined by his Minister of Education, Sergei Uvarov, and it contained 3 words that were supposed to summarize everything that made Russia Russia and that needed to be preserved against the corrosive influence of Western liberalism: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. The Orthodox faith as the spiritual foundation of the Russian people, the autocracy as the political form ordained by God and suited to the Russian character, nationality as the distinctively Russian identity that set the country apart from the decadent revolutionary West. It was coherent as an ideology. It was also a declaration that Russia would not change, that the answers had already been found, that questions were the problem rather than the solution. And yet Nicholas was not simply a man holding time still. His reign contained real achievements that complicate the simple picture of a frozen reactionary. Russia's first major railway line was built under his reign, connecting St. Petersburg to Tsarskoye Selo and later to Moscow, the beginning of a railway network that would eventually be central to the empire's integration. Legal codification, a project that had defeated every previous attempt at systematic organization, was finally completed under the extraordinary bureaucratic talent of Mikhail Speransky, who produced a new compilation of Russian law that brought order to what had been a chaos of overlapping statutes and decrees accumulated over centuries. The Hermitage, the imperial art collection that Catherine the Great had assembled, was opened to the public in 1852, making one of the world's great collections accessible to people who were not personally invited by the Tsar. Education expanded, even as its content was controlled. Russia's military was maintained at enormous expense and enormous scale, standing as the largest army in Europe and projecting power on the continent in ways that made Russia a decisive factor in post-Napoleonic European stability, or at least in post-Napoleonic European conservatism, which under Nicholas were the same thing. He was also, through no particular deliberate policy of his own, lucky enough to preside over one of the great flowerings of creative achievement in Russian cultural history. Pushkin wrote under Nicholas. Gogol wrote under Nicholas. Lermontov wrote under Nicholas. The great satirical playwright Griboyedov wrote under Nicholas, though he died in a diplomatic massacre in Persia in 1829 before he could write much more. The golden age of Russian literature was blooming directly under the shadow of the most repressive cultural regime since Ivan the Terrible, which tells you something genuinely interesting and genuinely unresolvable about the relationship between oppression and creative energy. Whether great literature flourishes under oppression because of it, or despite it, or simply in parallel to it is a question worth arguing about, though it is not exactly a lesson any sensible person would choose to apply deliberately. Pushkin, the greatest of these writers, had a complicated relationship with the Tsar that is worth lingering on because it captures something essential about Nicholas as a person. When Pushkin came back from a period of political exile imposed under Alexander I, Nicholas made an unusual arrangement. He removed Pushkin from the oversight of the third section and declared himself personally responsible for censoring Pushkin's work. He would read it himself. He would decide what could be published. In Nicholas's mind, this was probably a gesture of respect and perhaps even of protection, keeping the greatest writer in Russia under his personal care rather than the sometimes clumsy hands of the police bureaucracy. Pushkin experienced it as exactly what it was, which was surveillance and control dressed in the clothing of patronage. Pushkin was monitored informally throughout his life at Nicholas's court, his correspondence read, his associations noted, his finances subject to a kind of informal imperial oversight that he resented, and that his wife's position as a celebrated beauty at court made impossible to escape. When he died in January 1837, after a duel fought over his wife's honour in circumstances that remain somewhat murky even now, his death shook educated Russia in a way that made Nicholas nervous. The outpouring of grief was enormous, spontaneous and politically charged, because Pushkin had become more than a poet. He had become a symbol of everything the regime suppressed and failed to adequately value. Nicholas provided financial support to Pushkin's widow and settled his debts, which was genuinely decent. He also ensured that the funeral was small and private, and conducted without the public ceremony that might have turned a poet's burial into a political demonstration. He was, with Pushkin as with almost everything, simultaneously admiring and controlling, moved by the thing and afraid of it at the same time. The great failure of Nicholas's reign was the Crimean War, and it was a failure so comprehensive that it effectively ended everything he had built. The war broke out in 1853 over Russian pressure on the Ottoman Empire, and the determination of France and Britain to prevent Russia from dominating the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. What followed exposed something that people had perhaps half known but not fully confronted. Russia's military, for all its size and expense and the enormous prestige that Nicholas had invested in it, was falling behind. The roads and railways that would allow it to move men and equipment to the front simply were not adequate. The rifles carried by Russian infantry were outranged by those of their French and British opponents. The logistics of sustaining a siege at Sevastopol, the key Russian naval base in the Crimea, strained capacities that should have been sufficient and were not. The fortress held for nearly a year, which was genuinely impressive, but it fell in September 1855, and by then it no longer mattered to Nicholas personally. He died in March 1855 during the siege, officially of pneumonia contracted during a review of troops in cold weather, which was the kind of story that was plausible enough to be accepted and suspicious enough to be questioned. His physician apparently found him in circumstances that suggested the possibility of a deliberate overdose of medicine, and some contemporaries were quietly certain that Nicholas had chosen not to outlive his defeat. The official version was pneumonia, and it was pneumonia that was recorded and pneumonia that most historians have accepted, at least provisionally, as the cause of death. Whether or not he chose the timing, he was almost certainly spared the experience of watching the full consequences of the Crimean defeat unfold. Those consequences were severe and unavoidable. Russia had lost a war on its own soil to powers that had crossed seas to fight it. The military that had been the core of Nicholas's claim to great power status had proven inadequate against enemies using newer technology and better logistics. The infrastructure of the empire, the roads and railways and supply systems, had proven a critical weakness at exactly the moment when weakness was most expensive. Something had to change, and Nicholas's death ensured that the something would have to be decided by someone else. That someone else was his son. Alexander II came to power in the middle of a losing war, inheriting not only a military crisis but the accumulated weight of 30 years of frozen policy, 30 years of questions unasked and pressures unaddressed and changes deferred. He understood, immediately and clearly, something that his father had spent his reign insisting was not true. The iced Tsars' frozen empire was going to have to thaw. The only question was whether it could be done carefully enough to survive the process. Alexander II, the Tsar who almost saved Russia. Alexander II is one of those figures who make you want to argue with history. Not because he was flawless, he was not. But because what happened to him feels, even at a century and a half's distance, like a genuine tragedy. Here was a man who understood that Russia needed to change, who made changes that were real and significant, and who was blown up by a bomb thrown by the very people whose broader cause his reforms were supposed to address. It is the kind of story that makes you want to have words with the universe. He became Tsar in 1855, inherited the Crimean War, ended it with the Treaty of Paris in 1856 on unfavourable terms, and spent the rest of his reign trying to address the fundamental weaknesses the war had exposed. The single most consequential act of his reign, and arguably the single most consequential domestic act in Russian history since Peter the Great, was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. After centuries during which tens of millions of Russian peasants had been legally bound to the land and to their lords, they were freed. Alexander apparently said to a gathering of Moscow nobles that it is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for the serfs to begin to liberate themselves from below, which was a characteristically Russian way of making reform sound like self-defense, but which was also genuinely true. The emancipation was not perfect. It was not close to perfect, actually. The freed serfs received land, but they had to pay redemption payments for it over a period of 49 years, payments that in many cases left them in practical poverty, scarcely better than their former condition. They were freed as individuals but remained bound to their village commune, the mir, which controlled land allocation and collective tax obligations. Freedom in theory did not always translate to freedom in practice, but the principle had been established. Serfdom was over. The moral and legal foundation of the old social order had been removed. Everything else that happened in Russia for the next century happened in the shadow of this change. Alexander also reformed the judicial system, creating a genuinely independent judiciary with juries for the first time in Russian history. He established elected local government bodies, the Zemstvo, which gave the educated middle classes and local nobles a degree of participation in managing local affairs, schools, hospitals, roads, that they had not had before. He reformed the military. He expanded higher education and reduced censorship, creating conditions in which Russian cultural and intellectual life flourished. The universities produced the first generation of Russian students who had access to enough modern thought to start asking serious questions about whether the current system was the best possible system. Those students were a problem, not in themselves, but in what they represented. The reforms had created educated people who wanted more reform. It is one of the perennial dilemmas of modernizing autocracies. You need educated people to manage the modern state. Educated people tend to develop opinions. Opinions tend to include the opinion that the existing system is not good enough. Alexander's Russia produced, among its educated youth, an extraordinary diversity of radical thought, from various flavors of liberalism to socialism to populism to nihilism to anarchism, all circulating in the universities and in the underground presses that the relaxed censorship had made somewhat easier to produce. The populist movement, the Narodniks, who believed that the salvation of Russia lay in the peasantry, and tried to bring revolutionary ideas to the villages in the 1870s, were followed by more radical groups who concluded that the peasants were not interested in being saved and that terrorism was a more efficient tool of political change. The organisation Narodnaya Volya, People's Will, formed in 1879 and made the assassination of Alexander II its primary goal. They tried repeatedly. Alexander survived several attempts, including a bomb placed in the Winter Palace itself in 1880, which killed 11 people but missed the Tsar. By this point, Alexander had already moved in a more conservative direction, appointing the hardline Dmitry Tolstoy as Minister of the Interior and reducing some of the earlier liberal reforms. But in the final months of his reign, he was apparently preparing to sign a document, drafted by his Interior Minister Loris Melikov, that would have established consultative bodies with elected representatives, a small step towards something that might eventually have become a constitutional arrangement. He signed or was about to sign this document in March 1881. On March 13th, on his way home from a military review, a member of People's Will threw a bomb at his carriage. It injured the Cossack escort, but not the Tsar. Alexander, who had survived enough assassination attempts to know better, got out of the carriage to see the wounded. A second bomber threw another bomb. This one landed at the Tsar's feet. The explosion destroyed his legs. Alexander II died a few hours later. His son, watching him die, apparently told his father that he should not worry, that he would never take his reforms further. Whether or not this is precisely what was said, it captured perfectly what Alexander III believed, and what he would spend his entire reign demonstrating. Alexander III. Reaction, repression, and the coiled spring. Alexander III was everything his father was not. He was big, physically powerful, given to crushing silver coins between his fingers as a demonstration of his strength and his feelings about more subtle approaches to statecraft. He was conservative in every sense of the word. He believed in autocracy with a sincerity that his grandfather Nicholas would have recognized immediately. He believed that his father had been too liberal, that liberalism was a Western disease, and that Russia's salvation lay in the suppression of reform movements and the vigorous reassertion of the principles of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. His first act as Tsar was to tear up the Loris Melikov proposal for consultative bodies. It was a signal of what was to come. The 1880s and early 1890s under Alexander III were years of reaction across the board. The Zemstvo's authority was curtailed. The independence of the judiciary was restricted. University autonomy was reduced. Press censorship was tightened. Minority peoples within the empire, Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Jews, Finns, were subjected to Russification campaigns designed to assimilate them into a Russian national culture, whether they wanted to be assimilated or not. Jewish communities were subjected to increasing legal restrictions, including laws limiting where they could live, and the government's response to the anti-Jewish pogroms that broke out periodically was at best indifferent, and at worst quietly permissive. The political police, reorganized as the Okhrana in 1880, was expanded and professionalized. Revolutionary organizations were infiltrated with agents provocateurs. Many radical activists were arrested, exiled to Siberia, or driven abroad. The 5 members of People's Will directly responsible for Alexander II's assassination were hanged, including the only woman among them, Sofia Perovskaya. Among those executed was Alexander Ulyanov, whose younger brother Vladimir was 17 years old at the time and would later be known by a different name. Vladimir Lenin. History connects its dots with an indifference to subtlety that is occasionally breathtaking. The irony of Alexander III's reign is that in purely economic terms, Russia was doing reasonably well. Under the energetic finance minister Sergei Vita, who would continue to serve under the next Tsar, Russia was industrializing rapidly. The Trans-Siberian Railway, one of the great engineering projects of the 19th century, was begun in 1891. Foreign investment flowed in. Industrial production grew. New cities developed around factories in the Donbass and the Urals and the Moscow region. This industrialization was creating a new social class that Alexander III's political system was not equipped to deal with. The industrial working class, concentrated in cities, working long hours for low wages in frequently dangerous conditions, living in overcrowded tenements, was a social force that did not fit neatly into the Russian political order of autocracy, nobility, and peasantry. They were not serfs, they were not nobles, they were something new, and the grievances they carried were not the diffuse resentments of the peasant village, but the concentrated, organised anger of people who worked together in the same factories and lived together in the same neighbourhoods and could, in principle, act together. Alexander III never confronted this problem directly. He died in 1894 of kidney disease, at the age of 49, prematurely old for a man of his physical strength. He left behind a Russia that was economically growing and politically calcified, sitting on a social pressure that his policies had systematically denied any legitimate outlet. He also left behind a son, Nicholas, who was 26 years old, who had spent his father's reign being sheltered from the actual business of governance, and who was about to discover that being Tsar of Russia in the early 20th century was among the more demanding jobs in the world. Nicholas apparently told his cousin that he was not ready to be Tsar, that he had never been properly taught how to govern, that he did not know what was going to happen. He was right on all counts. But the throne did not care about redness. Nicholas II, the last Tsar and the weight. He could not carry. Let us try to see Nicholas Romanov clearly, because he has attracted both too much sympathy and too little, and neither serves historical understanding. He was a kind man in his personal relationships. He was devoted to his wife and children in ways that were genuine and that, in less catastrophic circumstances, would simply be admirable. He was patient, considerate to servants and subordinates, thoughtful in small matters. The diaries he kept throughout his reign are striking for how consistently they record ordinary pleasures, dinners with family, walks in the grounds, card games in the evening, the weather, the health of the children, in a tone of mild contentment that seems wholly disconnected from the scale of the disasters occurring around him. This is both touching and terrifying, because what Russia needed in 1894 was not a kind man with simple domestic pleasures. It needed someone who could read a historical situation with clarity, who could identify what was changing in Russian society and respond to it, who could make decisions and live with them, who could distinguish between the things that could be held and the things that could not. Nicholas could do almost none of these things. He had his father's conservatism without his father's force. He had absorbed Alexander III's belief in autocracy as a genuine conviction, not just a political position, but a moral and religious duty. He believed that the autocracy was what God had entrusted to him, that to diminish it was to betray both God and Russia, and that he was therefore not free to change the fundamental character of the system, even if circumstances seemed to demand it. This was not simply stubbornness or rigidity, though it was both of those things too. It was a genuine theological conviction, and that made it essentially impossible to reason with. His wife Alexandra, formerly Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, reinforced this. Alexandra was a devoted Orthodox convert, deeply religious, intensely loyal to Nicholas personally, and utterly convinced that any concession of autocratic power was both wrong in principle and dangerous in practice. Where Nicholas occasionally wavered, Alexandra stiffened his resolve. She was, in the estimate of many historians, the more determined autocrat of the two, and her influence on her husband was deep and constant. Their marriage was, for what it's worth, genuinely happy. They had 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, born between 1895 and 1901, and then in 1904, the long-awaited son and heir, Alexei. Alexei's birth was greeted with celebration. It was followed when the truth became clear with something closer to quiet despair. Alexei had haemophilia. Haemophilia, in 1904, before modern treatment, was not merely a medical condition. It was a death sentence suspended. Alexei could bleed internally from minor injuries, suffering agonizing episodes that the doctors of the time could do essentially nothing to address. He could not be allowed to play as other children played. He could not be told the complete truth about his condition. His parents, particularly Alexandra, were consumed with worry about him, and this anxiety shaped decisions, brought unwelcome people into the imperial household, and created a vulnerability in the most private space of the family that would be exploited with catastrophic results. Nicholas took the throne in the middle of enormous economic and social change that his father's policies had suppressed but had not resolved. The industrialization that Witte was driving so energetically was producing exactly the kind of social tensions that the political system had no mechanism to handle. Industrial workers were organizing. The intelligentsia was radicalized. The peasantry, freed from serfdom but still paying redemption payments and still dominated by the commune, was hungry for land. And the empire itself, multinational, multilingual, incorporating dozens of peoples who had not chosen to be Russian subjects, was holding together partly through force and partly through inertia. Nicholas's response to these pressures was essentially to deny that they required any fundamental change. He believed in the existing system and intended to maintain it. His early declaration, in a speech in 1895, that those who dream of taking part in governing are pursuing senseless dreams, was both personally sincere and politically catastrophic, because it told the educated classes who had hoped for gradual reform under a new Tsar that there was no legitimate path for their aspirations. The pressures would not wait. Revolution in the air, 1905 and the warning no one heeded. In January 1905, a priest named Father Georgy Gapon led a peaceful procession of workers and their families through the streets of St. Petersburg toward the Winter Palace. They were carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar. They were singing hymns and patriotic songs. They were, in the most literal possible sense, going to speak to the little father, the Batushka, the Tsar who was supposed to be the protector of his people. The petition they carried asked for an 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, freedom of speech and assembly, and a constituent assembly elected by universal suffrage. Nicholas was not at the Winter Palace. He was at Tsarskoye Selo. The troops who were at the Winter Palace, facing a crowd of perhaps 150,000 people, opened fire. The official death toll from what came to be called Bloody Sunday was between 100 and 200 people, though some estimates are considerably higher. The political consequences were immeasurable. In a single afternoon, the image of the Tsar as the benevolent little father, protector of his people, was destroyed for enormous numbers of Russians who had previously maintained it. If the Tsar's soldiers would shoot at workers carrying icons and singing hymns, then what was the Tsar? What followed was the revolution of 1905, a year of strikes, mutinies, peasant uprisings, and political agitation that brought the empire to its knees. The mutiny on the battleship Potemkin in June, when the crew murdered their officers and sailed the ship to an Odessa that was already in revolt, became one of the iconic moments of the year. General strikes paralysed the cities in October. Finland, Poland, the Baltic provinces, the Caucasus, all erupted in various forms of unrest. The army remained loyal in most places, but its loyalty was being tested. Nicholas's response under enormous pressure from his advisers and particularly from Witte was the October Manifesto of 1905, which promised freedom of speech, assembly, and conscience, and most significantly promised a legislative assembly, the Duma, with real power to pass laws. It was the most dramatic concession of autocratic power in Russian history, and it was enough to split the opposition and allow the government to restore order. The more moderate liberals accepting the manifesto as a starting point, and the more radical revolutionaries, who were in any case disorganized and unprepared, being suppressed through a combination of military force and improved intelligence work. Nicholas hated the October Manifesto. He had signed it because Witte told him the choice was this or a military dictator, and he could not find a suitable military dictator. He spent the next 12 years trying to limit the damage from what he had promised. The Duma that was created was hobbled from the start. The fundamental laws of 1906, which Nicholas issued just before the Duma met for the first time, reserved enormous powers to the Tsar, including the ability to dissolve the Duma and the exclusive right to govern by decree when the Duma was not in session. The first Duma was dissolved after 73 days for being too liberal. The second Duma lasted a similar length of time. The third Duma, elected under a new electoral law that dramatically reduced the representation of peasants and non-Russian peoples, while increasing that of the landed gentry, managed to survive its full term and cooperate sufficiently with the government to allow the Stolypin reforms to proceed. Pyotr Stolypin, Nicholas's prime minister from 1906 until his assassination in 1911, was probably the most capable statesman of the last Romanov decades. He recognized that the existing commune-based agricultural system was economically inefficient and socially destabilizing, and he created a legal framework by which peasants could consolidate their strips of communal land into consolidated private holdings. The reforms were producing real changes in the Russian countryside and might, given time, have created the stable peasant landowning class that Stolypin believed was the social foundation any durable order required. When Stolypin was assassinated in the Kiev Opera House in 1911, shot by a man who may or may not have been an agent of the Okhrana operating on unclear instructions, Russia lost the one figure in Nicholas's government who had both the intellectual capacity and the political will to navigate the country towards something more stable. Nicholas had never been entirely comfortable with Stolypin's energy and independence, and some historians have suggested that the Tsar was not entirely sorry to see him gone, which if true says something important about the self-defeating character of Nicholas's reign. The years between 1905 and 1914 were years of relative stability but not of resolution. The Duma continued, imperfect and constrained. The economy grew, and Russia was genuinely doing better in material terms than it had been a decade earlier. But the fundamental tensions, the aspirations of the educated classes for genuine political participation, the hunger of the peasantry for more land, the grievances of the industrial working class, the resentments of the non-Russian peoples of the empire were still present, still growing, still without any legitimate outlets sufficient to contain them. And into all of this was about to walk, or rather limp, one of the most extraordinary and inexplicable characters in the entire Romanov story. Rasputin, the strangest chapter in a very strange story. I have been waiting to get to this chapter since we started, not because it is the most historically important part of the Romanov story, because it is not, but because it is the chapter that most requires careful handling and which is most commonly mishandled. Rasputin has become, in popular culture, a figure of almost mythological proportions. The mad monk who seduced the empress, who could not be killed, who controlled Russia from behind the throne. Almost none of this is entirely accurate, and yet the reality of Rasputin is, if anything, stranger than the legend. Grigory Yefimovich. Rasputin was born around 1869 in a Siberian village called Pokrovskoye in Tobolsk province. He was not a monk. He was a peasant who had a religious experience in his youth, travelled to various holy sites, developed a reputation as a starets, a holy man with healing gifts, and made his way eventually to St. Petersburg, where he attracted the attention of various members of the aristocracy, who were interested, as many people of that period were, in spiritual experience and mystical religion. He arrived in the orbit of the imperial family in 1905. What brought him there, and what kept him there, was the one thing that mattered more to Alexandra than anything else in the world. He appeared to be able to help Alexei. The mechanism by which Rasputin seemed to alleviate Alexei's haemophilia episodes has been debated ever since. Hypnosis has been suggested. The relaxation he induced reducing blood pressure has been proposed. The most dramatic suggestion is that it was essentially faith healing, that the power of Alexandra's belief in Rasputin's intercession was enough, through some psychosomatic mechanism, to produce real physiological effects. What is beyond dispute is that on several occasions when Alexei was in crisis, bleeding internally and apparently close to death, Rasputin's presence or even his telegrams seemed to produce improvement. This was enough for Alexandra. She was certain he was a man of God. For Nicholas, who loved his wife and his son, and who was not himself persuaded of Rasputin's divinity, the situation was more complicated. He tolerated Rasputin because Alexandra needed him. He referred to Rasputin in his diaries as our friend, which is the kind of careful neutrality that suggests private reservations maintained behind a diplomatic facade. Rasputin was not simply a healer or a holy man. He was also a man with enormous appetites for food, for women, for wine, for the company of influential people, for the exercise of his own considerable charisma. His behaviour in St. Petersburg society was spectacular in the worst possible way. He drank heavily, was apparently sexually voracious, and was not careful about who saw him doing either. The stories about him multiplied and became more lurid with each telling. Some were true, some were embellished, some were invented entirely by his enemies. But the overall portrait of a Siberian peasant with unwashed hair and hypnotic eyes, conducting himself with complete indifference to the norms of aristocratic society, was real enough. The political consequences were serious. As Rasputin's connection to the imperial family became widely known, it damaged the reputation of the court dramatically. The story that a filthy peasant mystic had the ear of the empress and through her of the Tsar himself was grist for every satirist, every political opponent, every newspaper editor who could find a way to print it. The more offensive and frankly obscene rumours about the nature of Rasputin's relationship with Alexandra were almost certainly false, but they circulated regardless, because they were useful to everyone who wanted to delegitimize the imperial family. Rasputin also inserted himself into political matters in ways that went well beyond his role as a healer. He recommended and sometimes secured the dismissal of ministers he disliked, and the appointment of people who had cultivated his favour. He opposed Russia's entry into the First World War, correctly identifying it as catastrophic, and later lobbied for a negotiated peace. He was, in his irregular way, actually more politically sensible on some of these questions than the people who were dismissing him. But the manner of his influence was so irregular, so outside any normal channel of political accountability, that it further undermined whatever credibility Nicholas's government retained. The decision to murder him was made in December 1916 by a group of people who are, in their own ways, as extraordinary as Rasputin himself. The central figure was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, who was married to the Tsar's niece. He was joined by the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Nicholas's cousin, and a conservative politician named Vladimir Purishkevich. Their motivation was partly political. The belief that Rasputin was destroying the monarchy's reputation and needed to be removed, and partly personal, in Yusupov's case, at a level of complexity that his later memoirs are not entirely forthcoming about. What happened on the night of December 16th to 17th, 1916 in the Yusupov Palace basement has been disputed almost from the moment it occurred. According to Yusupov's account, Rasputin was invited to the palace, fed wine and cakes laced with cyanide, shot when the poison failed to work, shot again, beaten, and then dropped through a hole in the ice of a frozen canal. The famous detail that he was still alive when they threw him in the water was probably not accurate. The post-mortem evidence suggesting he drowned in the river, but the Rasputin that would not die story was too good not to spread and has been spreading ever since. What is true is that Rasputin was dead, and that the imperial family were devastated, particularly Alexandra, and that Rasputin's removal did not in fact save the dynasty. The damage was already done, the revolution was already preparing itself, and the absence of Rasputin made no meaningful political difference to what came next. He was, in the end, a symptom rather than a cause, an indicator of how dysfunctional the imperial court had become, how isolated from any accurate understanding of Russia's situation, how dependent on personal relationships and mystical consolations, instead of the political engagement that the moment required. His influence tells us less about Rasputin than it does about Alexandra, and less about Alexandra than it does about Nicholas, and less about Nicholas than it does about the entire system of autocracy that had placed the fate of 170 million people in the hands of one family, and that family's very particular preoccupations. The World War and the unravelling Russia went to war in August 1914, in a rush of patriotism that briefly, genuinely united the country, in ways that had not been seen in years. The Duma voted war credits unanimously. Streets in St. Petersburg, now renamed the more Russian-sounding Petrograd, filled with crowds cheering and waving flags. The city's German community was attacked by angry mobs. The war seemed to offer what wars sometimes seem to offer in their early days, a simplification of everything complicated, a moment when the divisions of class and politics dissolved into shared national purpose. The simplification did not last. Russia mobilized its enormous army, which was in numbers one of the largest in the world, but which was hampered by the same problems that had been exposed in the Crimean War and in the Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Supply chains were inadequate, communications were poor, equipment was insufficient, particularly artillery shells, which were consumed at a rate that Russian industry could not keep up with. Officers were frequently incompetent, appointed by seniority and political connection rather than ability, and the sheer scale of the front, which stretched for over 1,000 miles, created logistical challenges that the Russian military bureaucracy was simply not equipped to manage. The first engagements in Prussia were disasters. At Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in August and September 1914, 2 Russian armies were destroyed by German forces commanded by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, with combined Russian casualties exceeding 300,000 men. The disasters in Prussia were offset somewhat by better performance against Austro-Hungary, where Russian forces made substantial gains in Galicia, but the pattern of the war on the Eastern Front was established early. Russia could suffer casualties on a scale that would destroy other armies and still keep fighting, but it could not translate this human capacity into consistent military effectiveness. By 1915, the situation was deeply serious. The German army launched a massive offensive that drove Russian forces out of Poland, Lithuania, and much of the Galician gains. Millions of refugees streamed eastward ahead of the advancing German and Austrian armies. The army was running short of shells, short of rifles, short of boots. Soldiers were sometimes sent to the front without weapons and told to pick up those dropped by the dead. In this crisis, Nicholas made the decision that proved most consequential of all his personal decisions. In September 1915, he dismissed his uncle, the Grand Duke Nicholas, as commander-in-chief of the Russian armies and assumed personal command himself. This was a catastrophic miscalculation for reasons that are almost too numerous to list. Nicholas was not a general. He had no military training at the level required to command a multi-front war. He had no gift for strategic thinking. He was patient and conscientious, but not decisive. His presence at Stavka, the military headquarters, meant that he was absent from Petrograd for long stretches, leaving Alexandra, who was already under Rasputin's influence, effectively in charge of civilian governance. And most importantly, it meant that every military failure, every retreat, every disaster could now be laid directly at the Tsar's personal door. He had attached his personal reputation to the conduct of the war in a way that made the military situation and his political position inseparable. The war corroded everything. The economy strained under the demands of supplying the front. Food supplies to the cities became irregular. Prices rose. The railway system, never adequate, was overwhelmed by military demands at the expense of civilian transport. In Petrograd and Moscow, queues formed for bread in the cold. Workers who had been working longer hours for lower real wages for years began to reach the end of their tolerance. The upper classes were no less alienated. The Duma, which had initially supported the war, formed a progressive bloc by 1915 that demanded a government of public confidence, meaning ministers accountable to the Duma rather than just to the Tsar. Nicholas refused. He prorogued the Duma when its demands became too insistent. The gap between the government and the educated opinion that might have supported it widened. The Zemstvo unions and the war industries committees, voluntary organizations set up to assist with war supply and medical care, demonstrated that educated Russians were capable of effective self-organization on a large scale. This was both useful and threatening, because it raised the obvious question of why this capacity for self-organization should not extend to politics. By the winter of 1916 to 1917, the signs of imminent collapse were everywhere that had eyes to see them. Military intelligence was reporting unrest in the army. Police reports described the mood of the urban population as explosive. Members of the Duma were saying privately that revolution was inevitable. Even some members of the imperial family were warning Nicholas that radical change was necessary. Nicholas did not believe them. Or perhaps he believed that belief was not what he owed the situation, that his duty was to hold on regardless of what came, because God had given him the autocracy, and he could not simply give it away because things were difficult. This was not simply obstinacy. It was, in his terms, conscience. It was also, in practical terms, the end of the dynasty. 1917, the revolution that ended everything. February. 1917 began with bread queues and cold. In Petrograd, the food supply was failing. Women who had stood in queues for hours and received nothing had run out of patience that was already stretched thin by years of war and rising prices and absent husbands. On February 23rd, which was International Women's Day in the socialist calendar, women textile workers in the Vyborg district of Petrograd went on strike and began marching through the streets. They were joined by other workers. By the end of the day, somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people were on strike in Petrograd. The movement grew the next day and the day after. Workers from more factories joined. Some were calling for bread, some were calling for an end to the war, some were calling for the overthrow of the autocracy. The Cossacks who were sent to disperse the crowds sat their horses but did not charge. On February 26th, troops fired on demonstrators in several places, killing dozens. But on February 27th, something happened that Nicholas's government had not seriously prepared for, even though it was the one thing that had always preserved the autocracy in previous crises. The soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. Garrison troops in Petrograd began defecting to the revolution, not because of political ideology in most cases, but because they were mostly recent recruits and conscripts who identified with the people in the streets more than with the officers giving them orders to shoot. The February Revolution was not organized by any political party or movement. The Bolsheviks were mostly in exile or underground. The socialist revolutionaries were not prepared. The Mensheviks were disorganized. What happened in Petrograd in the last days of February 1917 was a spontaneous uprising of people who had simply had enough, and its immediate success owed more to the failure of the army to suppress it than to any revolutionary organization. Nicholas was at Stavka when the reports began arriving. He responded by ordering troops to restore order and then trying to return to Petrograd by train. The train was stopped at Pskov because the railway lines were no longer under government control. The generals commanding his armies telegraphed him one by one, all of them saying the same thing. The situation could not be restored. He must abdicate. On March 2nd, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated the throne of Russia. He tried to abdicate in favour of his son Alexei. Then, realising that Alexei's haemophilia would likely kill him before he could rule, abdicated in favour of his brother Michael instead. Michael declined the throne the next day, saying he would accept it only from a constituent assembly, which was a reasonable position, but which also meant that the Romanov dynasty had, in the space of 48 hours, effectively ended. 304 years after Michael Romanov had wept in the Apatiev monastery and been persuaded to take a throne he did not want, the last Nicholas wept at Pskov and gave it up. The provisional government that replaced the Romanov autocracy was a coalition of Duma liberals and moderate socialists who faced an immediate and fundamental challenge. They were trying to establish a legitimate democratic government in the middle of a world war, with an economy in crisis, with a population exhausted by 3 years of fighting, and with a rival power centre, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, operating simultaneously and claiming to represent the will of the people more authentically than the middle-class liberals of the provisional government. The provisional government's decision to continue the war was the decision that destroyed it. They believed, partly from genuine conviction, and partly from the pressure of their French and British allies, who were providing loans and material on which Russia depended, that Russia had to fight on until a democratic peace could be achieved. The soldiers in the army, and there were millions of them, largely did not agree. They wanted peace. They wanted to go home. They wanted the land that everyone had been promising them. Into this situation arrived, in April 1917, a sealed train car from Zurich carrying the leader of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin. The Germans had allowed the train through because they calculated correctly that Lenin's return would destabilize Russia and take it out of the war. Lenin arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd, was greeted by a crowd and by the leaders of the Soviet, delivered a speech standing on an armoured car outside the station that reportedly left the moderate socialists who heard it speechless, and announced that the revolution had not gone far enough and was not going to stop. Lenin's position was clear. No cooperation with the provisional government, no continuation of the war, immediate transfer of power to the Soviets, land to the peasants, peace to the soldiers, power to the workers. His slogans were simple, and they addressed themselves directly to the desires of millions of exhausted, hungry people who had heard complicated justifications for complicated policies long enough. The Bolsheviks had a failed attempted coup in July, the July days, when their supporters in Petrograd rose prematurely and were suppressed, with Lenin briefly fleeing to Finland. But the Kornilov affair in August, when the Commander-in-Chief Lava Kornilov appeared to be leading a coup against the provisional government, and the government had to appeal to the Soviets, including the Bolsheviks, to defend Petrograd, fatally damaged the credibility of both the military leadership and the moderate socialists, while arming and legitimizing the Bolsheviks. By October, the provisional government was governing in name only. It controlled the building it met in and not much else. Lenin returned from Finland in disguise, argued in the Bolshevik Central Committee for immediate armed insurrection, and won. On the night of October 24th to 25th, Bolshevik-aligned forces of the Military Revolutionary Committee seized key points in Petrograd: the bridges, the post offices, the telegraph exchanges, the railway stations. The Winter Palace was surrounded. The ministers of the provisional government were arrested, by and large without serious resistance. The October Revolution took place with remarkably little violence in Petrograd itself. The old government simply dissolved, without anyone being willing to defend it. Whatever mandate the provisional government had carried from the February days had long since been exhausted by its failures. The Bolsheviks stepped into a vacancy. What Lenin announced to the Congress of Soviets in the early hours of October 25th was Soviet power. The world would, in time, understand what that meant. For the Romanovs, it meant something specific and dreadful, because the new Soviet government had specific plans for what to do with the former Tsar and his family, though those plans were not yet entirely formed and would develop over the next several months in directions that combined revolutionary ideology, practical necessity, and personal vindictiveness into something that ended in abasement: the House of Special Purpose. The final days of the Romanovs. After the abdication in March 1917, the Romanovs had been kept under house arrest at Tsarskoye Selo, the imperial family's palace outside Petrograd. They were, in the early months, treated reasonably. Nicholas tended his garden. The children played and had lessons. Alexandra prayed. Nicholas read histories and the Bible. They were a family in a strange suspension, their old world entirely ended and their new one not yet defined. The provisional government had considered sending them to Britain, and Britain had initially agreed to receive them. King George V, Nicholas's first cousin, had apparently approved the idea and then withdrawn the offer, reportedly concerned about the political implications of harbouring the deposed autocrat. This decision, small in its making and enormous in its consequences, left the Romanovs without the foreign refuge that might have saved them. After the Bolshevik seizure of power, their situation deteriorated. In August 1917, the provisional government, increasingly nervous about their safety in the unstable capital, had moved them to Tobolsk in western Siberia, a small provincial town sufficiently remote that it seemed secure. They arrived on a boat and were installed in the former governor's house, which was comfortable enough. The guards treated them with relative decency. Life settled into a routine of lessons and prayers and reading aloud, and the small dramas of a large family confined to limited space. Alexei's haemophilia continued to torment the family. His episodes of internal bleeding were frequent and agonizing. Nicholas and Alexandra, watching their son suffer without Rasputin's mysterious interventions and without any effective medical treatment, maintained their composure in the diaries they kept. But the accounts they left of his crises are heartbreaking. Here are parents who understand that their child is in constant danger of a painful death, and who can do nothing about it, maintaining what must have been an exhausting performance of calm. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the situation at Tobolsk changed. The guards were replaced with men more aligned with the new regime and considerably less inclined to courtesy. Orders arrived from Moscow restricting the family's activities, reducing their allowances, limiting their contact with the outside world. In the spring of 1918, decisions were made in Moscow about the Romanovs' future, though the exact nature of those decisions and who made them has been debated by historians ever since. The explanation that had the most strategic clarity was that the Romanovs could not be allowed to be captured by the White Armies, the anti-Bolshevik forces who were fighting the civil war that had erupted after the Bolshevik seizure of power. A living former Tsar in white hands would be an enormous propaganda asset and a potential rallying point. What should be done to prevent this was a question that the Bolshevik leadership, particularly Lenin and Sverdlov, the head of the Soviet's executive committee, apparently addressed without putting too much on paper. In April 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra and their daughter Maria were taken from Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg in the Urals, a city that was a Bolshevik stronghold. The other children followed in May, when Alexei had recovered enough from a severe bleeding episode to travel. They were installed in the house of a merchant named Nikolai Ipatiev, the house of special purpose, Ipatiev House. There it is again, the name that brackets the dynasty. The family's confinement at Ipatiev House was strict and demeaning. The guards were revolutionary soldiers whose attitude toward their prisoners was hostile and sometimes deliberately humiliating. The family shared cramped rooms. They were watched constantly, their every movement monitored. Guards drew obscene cartoons on the walls outside their rooms. They were not allowed to close bathroom doors. Mail was read. Outside contact was almost entirely prevented, except for occasional smuggled notes from monarchist sympathizers who were trying to organize a rescue. This was the summer of 1918. The Bolsheviks were fighting a civil war on multiple fronts. Czech Legion forces, made up of former prisoners of war who were trying to reach Vladivostok to eventually fight in France, had seized control of the Trans-Siberian Railway and were advancing on Yekaterinburg. The city might fall to anti-Bolshevik forces within days or weeks. The question of what to do with the Romanovs was becoming urgent. On the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, the commandant of Ipatiev House, Yakov Yurovsky, had the family woken in the night and told to dress. They were told they were being moved for their safety, that fighting was approaching the city, and that they needed to relocate to a more secure location. Nicholas carried Alexei, who was not well enough to walk, down to the basement of the house. Alexandra, the 4 daughters, the family doctor Yevgeny Botkin, the cook, a footman, and a maid accompanied them. 11 people in a small basement room. They were arranged standing against the wall. Then Yurovsky read a sentence. "By the decision of the regional Soviet, you are to be shot." Nicholas apparently said what, and then the firing began. The execution did not go smoothly. Some of the men refused to shoot, others were drunk. The daughters, it was later discovered, had sewn jewels into their corsets, which deflected bullets and prolonged their deaths agonizingly. Alexei, who had survived the initial volley, had to be shot separately. The whole thing took somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes of chaotic violence before it was over. The bodies were loaded onto a truck driven into the forest outside Yekaterinburg, doused in acid, and buried in a shallow grave that was then covered over. 2 of the bodies, Alexei and one of the daughters, most likely Maria, were burned separately and buried elsewhere. The idea was to make identification impossible, to leave no remains that could become relics, no grave that could become a shrine. The Bolshevik announcement the next day said that Nicholas had been shot, that his family had been moved to a safe location. It was months before the truth began to emerge, and years before it was fully established. The deliberate obscuring of what had happened in that basement was itself part of the act, an attempt to deny closure, to deny even the basic human reality of what the Romanov family had been. 11 people, a man who had once commanded the largest empire on earth, and a woman who had been granddaughter to Queen Victoria, and 4 young women who had grown up in palaces, and a boy who was never going to be well, and a doctor who stayed with his patients, and a cook, and a maid, and a footman. 11 people in a basement in Yekaterinburg on a July night. The Czechoslovak forces entered Yekaterinburg on July 25th, 9 days later. They found the basement with its bullet holes and its traces of blood and its shattered plaster. They could see what had happened, but they could not find the bodies. It would take until 1991, when the Soviet Union was dissolving, for the main burial site to be officially discovered and excavated. In 1998, the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra and 3 of their daughters were reinterred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of Russian Tsars. The remains of Alexei and the 4th daughter were identified later, in 2007, and reinterred in 2009. The identification came through DNA analysis, using the living descendants of the family, including Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who was a maternal relative of Alexandra. The Romanovs and the British royal family connected one last time in a forensic laboratory, confirming through genetics what the historical record had already established. In 2008, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas, Alexandra and their children as passion bearers, a category of saint for those who accept suffering and death with Christian humility. They now stand in icons in Orthodox churches around Russia and around the world, haloed, their faces beatified into the fixed serenity that icon painting requires. The terrified family in the Ipatiev basement has become something else entirely, something that says things about Russian history and Russian identity that exceed the particular men and women who died there. The legacy of the Romanovs, what 300 years left behind. After the last shot was fired in the basement of Ipatiev House, Russia moved on. It had no choice. The civil war continued for another 3 years, killing millions more. Famine followed. Then Stalin, and what Stalin did is its own vast darkness. The Soviet century unfolded, the communist state that justified itself partly by reference to the dynasty it had overthrown. And yet the Romanovs did not disappear. They became, over time, something that the Bolsheviks had not intended them to become. They became symbolic. Let us think about what 300 years of Romanov rule actually produced, because the tendency is to end the story in the basement and forget that there was an empire and a civilization built by the people who came before. The most obvious legacy is territorial. The Russia that exists today, the largest country in the world by area, is largely a product of Romanov expansion. Peter the Great's wars gave Russia the Baltic coast. Catherine the Great's wars gave Russia the Black Sea. Alexander I's resistance to Napoleon consolidated Russia's position as a continental power. Alexander II's sale of Alaska to the United States in 1867 was the only significant territorial contraction of the Romanov period, and even then the core of the empire, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific and from the Arctic to Central Asia, remained. Modern Russia's map is a Romanov inheritance. The cultural legacy is equally profound. St. Petersburg, which Peter the Great built from nothing on a swamp, is one of the great cities of the world, whose architecture, museums and institutions are among the finest anywhere. The Hermitage, which Catherine assembled and which her successors expanded, contains one of the greatest art collections in existence. Russian literature, which developed its modern form under the Romanovs, with Pushkin under Nicholas I and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Chekhov under Alexander II and Alexander III, is among the achievements of world civilization. Russian music, Glinka, Tchaikovsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Mussorgsky, Rachmaninoff, is another. Russian ballet, Russian theatre. The cultural explosion of the Romanov centuries was genuinely extraordinary, even if it happened in the shadow of autocracy and serfdom. The institutional legacy is also real, though more complicated. The legal codes and administrative structures that the Romanovs built, however imperfect, provided the framework that the Soviet state inherited and adapted. The Russian army that defeated Napoleon was the ancestor of the Red Army that defeated Hitler. The railways that Witte built and the Trans-Siberian that was completed under Nicholas II connected a continent. The educational institutions that the Romanovs founded produced the scientists and engineers and writers who built the Soviet state and who made the Russian 20th century possible. The Romanovs also left behind, in the more negative column, the legacy of serfdom. The binding of the majority of Russia's population to the land from 1649 to 1861 created social wounds that emancipation in theory did not heal in practice, because emancipation left the former serfs without adequate land, burdened with redemption payments, and without the legal and economic infrastructure to establish themselves as independent farmers. The agrarian crisis of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the peasant hunger for land, the volatile rural poor who fueled the revolution, all trace back to the serfdom that Alexis legalized and his successors maintained. They left behind the legacy of autocracy, the conviction encoded in law and ideology and political culture that one person could and should exercise supreme power over the lives of 170 million people, and that any limitation of that power was a betrayal of divine order. This conviction, which was completely sincere in the Romanovs who held it, ensured that Russia never developed the political institutions that might have allowed it to manage change without catastrophic revolution. The British Parliament, the American constitutional system, the French Republic, whatever their flaws, provided mechanisms by which political grievances could be expressed and power could be held accountable. Russia had no such mechanisms because the Romanovs would not allow them. The revolution was not an accident of circumstance or the result of Bolshevik cunning alone. It was the consequence of 300 years of refusing to build the structures that might have made it unnecessary. And then there is the emotional legacy, which is harder to quantify but no less real. The story of the Romanovs, ending in that basement, has a quality that speaks to something deep in the human experience of history. Here is a family, real people with real relationships and real love for each other, who were born into a role that ultimately destroyed them and took them with it. The photographs of the family in their final years, the Empress and her daughters in white summer dresses, Alexei in his little sailor suit, Nicholas looking older than his years, have a particular quality of knowing what we know that makes them almost impossible to look at without feeling the weight of what was coming. This is why the Romanovs keep returning, keep being the subject of films and books and documentaries and channels like this one that spend several hours working through the story at 1 a.m. It is not simply historical interest. It is the combination of enormous scale and intimate human cost, empire and a family in a basement, 300 years and one night in July. The question of whether it had to end this way is one that historians continue to argue about, and the argument is worth having. Could Nicholas have managed the constitutional transition that Russia needed? The evidence strongly suggests he could not because the task was impossible in principle, but because his particular combination of beliefs and temperament and the specific situation he inherited made it essentially beyond him. Was there someone else in Russia who could have done what was necessary? Perhaps. Stolypin came closest. His assassination in 1911 removed the one figure who seemed to have both the clarity to see what was needed and the political capacity to pursue it. Could the revolution have been averted by different policies in 1916 or 1917? Possibly, if you could imagine a Nicholas who would have appointed a government of national confidence and made a separate peace with Germany and given the peasants their land, you can construct a version of history in which the February Revolution does not become the October Revolution, but that Nicholas would not have been Nicholas, and that Russia would not have been the Russia that Nicholas and his predecessors had built. The Romanovs created the conditions of their own destruction, not through some simple negligence or even simple cruelty, but through the accumulated weight of choices made over 300 years, each of them comprehensible in its own context and collectively catastrophic. That is perhaps the deepest lesson of their story. History is not made by villains and heroes as much as it is made by people responding to the situations they inherit, and sometimes the situations people inherit are situations in which the available responses are all, in one way or another, inadequate. After 1918, the surviving Romanovs, those who had been abroad when the revolution came or who had escaped in the chaos, scattered across Europe. Nicholas's mother Maria Fyodorovna lived in Denmark until 1928, apparently never fully accepting that her son was dead. Other family members settled in Paris, in London, in the Riviera, in the United States, maintaining in diminishing comfort the habits and memories of a world that no longer existed. Their descendants are alive today. There is an ongoing dispute among the surviving Romanov family members about dynastic precedents, about who has the better claim to represent the dynasty that no longer rules. It is, under the circumstances, a remarkably persistent argument, and it says something rather touching about the human attachment to continuity, to the idea that the bloodline still means something, even when the empire it once governed has been replaced twice over. Russia after the Romanovs was, in the short term, a story of extraordinary violence, the Civil War, the famine, Stalin's terror, the Gulag, the catastrophic German invasion of 1941. The Soviet century was, in its own ways, as shaped by the Romanov legacy as by the ideology that replaced it. The centralized autocratic state, the subordination of individual freedom to state purpose, the enormous gap between the governing elite and the governed population, these things did not disappear with the revolution. They continued under different names, with different justifications, and in some cases with even greater intensity. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, and when Russia began the uncertain project of becoming something other than a communist state, the Romanov legacy became available for new uses. Nicholas II was canonized. His face appeared on religious icons. The Ipatiev house, which had been demolished in 1977, on the orders of local Communist Party officials who were nervous about it becoming a place of pilgrimage, was replaced in 2003 by a cathedral on the blood built on the site of the executions. The Russian Orthodox Church, whose institutional independence the Romanovs had ended and the Soviets had brutally suppressed, was rebuilt, and the last Romanovs became part of its sacred calendar. This is perhaps the most unexpected legacy of all. The dynasty that created the Russian Empire, that extended it from the Baltic to the Pacific, that built St. Petersburg and the Hermitage and patronized Pushkin, and eventually failed catastrophically under the weight of its own contradictions, ended in that basement in Yekaterinburg and became saints. History is not always tidy. It is not always just. It does not distribute its rewards and its suffering with any obvious attention to merit. The Romanovs, the ordinary and the extraordinary alike, got a story that was bigger than any of them could manage, and it ended as stories of that size often do, with blood and silence and abasement in the Urals. 304 years, one dynasty, 11 people in a room, and the rivers and the steppes and the forests of Russia, which are still there, which were there before the Romanovs, and will be there long after, flowing and blowing and growing with the complete indifference of the natural world to the ambitions and the suffering and the triumphs of the human beings who have always been trying to make something lasting in the enormous, beautiful, terrifying landscape that Russia is. We have been at this for several hours now. The story is as complete as any story this long and this complicated can be. If you're still listening, I am genuinely impressed. And if you have fallen asleep somewhere around Peter the Great, which is honestly a reasonable place to fall asleep, I hope the rest of the journey was peaceful. Thank you for joining me tonight. Dim the lights, if they're not already dim. Let the story settle. The Romanovs are 300 years in the past and also in their way, present whenever you look at a map of Russia, or walk through a museum that Catherine built, or read a poem that Pushkin wrote in the shadow of Nicholas I's censors. History does not end, it only transforms, and tonight it transforms into sleep. Good night.